And then I spent nearly 20,000 dekarmas storming that building and clearing out the corrupted seed-bearers, Jensen said, voice low as he surveyed the makeshift encampment in the trees. We pulled out who we could and fell back into the forest. But as you can see, it's been slow going. Torwin followed his apprentice's gaze, taking in the ragged collection of refugees, injured villagers, scared children, low-level laborers, all exhausted and unfit for the wilderness. Injured, children, no training, no survival skills, he muttered, nodding as he ticked each weakness off on his fingers. Still, why camp here in the woods? Why not push on to the next town? We tried, Jensen said grimly. I scouted ahead myself. Turns out D-Shur wasn't the only place hit. Looks like it started with people who spent time out in the wilderness. Loggers, hunters, scouts. They brought the infection back with them. I think the monsters can't grow new seeds quickly, or they'd have already overrun the frontier. He paused, glancing down at his mud-caked boots. We burned D-Shur's supply, but it probably only affected half the town. Beldrit's worse, full-blown paranoia. People don't know who's corrupted anymore. There's fighting in the streets. Sildra went to help, he added after a beat. She's got a skill that can spot the corrupted, but only at night. Convincing someone that their brother or wife is just a puppet now. That's not easy. Torwin exhaled slowly. Gods, if it's reached Beldrit, it could have spread farther. If we don't contain this, it's going to ripple outward like a plague. We need to burn out every infected seed-bearer before this jumps to the outer towns. I agree, Jensen said. But if we abandon these people now, they're just fresh victims. I think I torched every seed cache in D-Shur, but if I missed one, we'd be handing them more hosts. Torwin crossed his arms. So what's your plan? Besides waiting for you to show up? Jensen grinned faintly. Sildra clears Beldrit. We move the refugees there. I start sniping any remaining corrupted in D-Shur, and she continues on to cellar it to assess that town. Rinse and repeat. It was solid, careful, strategic, too slow. Torwin's gut told him that the monsters wouldn't sit around waiting to be exterminated. The synchronized outbreaks in D-Shur and Beldrit suggested coordination, something worse than random corruption. If you're sure D-Shur is overrun, I'll go back and clean it out, Torwin said. You stay here. Help Sildra stabilize Beldrit and get the people moving. I'll catch up. They're monsters, Jensen confirmed. Sildra's skill hasn't failed once. Every person she's marked has triggered a kill notification. We can't guarantee there aren't undetected ones hiding, but it doesn't seem likely. Good enough for me. Torwin nodded. Now, before I head off, tell me about your class evolution options. He'd already used Identify and confirmed that Jensen still showed as a tracker, which meant he hadn't committed yet. That grin on his apprentice's face? Promising. I got the usual side grades. Explorer, Archer, nothing too exciting. 2 rare classes popped, though, Heavy Artillery and Champion of the Forest. Torwin raised a brow. Heavy Artillery was no surprise. Jensen had described raining destruction with explosives and overwhelming force. It tracked. But Champion of the Forest? That was odd. Protector class. Didn't really fit Jensen's style or personality. Likely connected to Sildra and their time together. Those kinds of bonds could leave a strong imprint. Thinking about either of them, Torwin asked. They won't lead me toward Ranger, Jensen said. And anyway, there was that tone again. Teasing. Playful. Torwin narrowed his eyes. Let me guess, you got something better. An uncommon with a rare path? Or, epic, Jensen said, smug. Torwin blinked. You didn't. I did. A laugh burst out of the old hunter, loud and warm. Huh, that's incredible. Well done, boy. What is it? Jensen hesitated, the grin faltering. That's the thing, he said. It's not conventional. I don't think my father will approve. But it's epic. How can I not take it? Still, I was hoping you could help me make the case. If Jensen hadn't already taken it, that meant it was something far outside his father's plans. Torwin's interest sharpened. Out with it, then. What is it? Vault Seeker. Torwin inhaled sharply. That was huge. Vault Seeker was one of the most coveted classes in the world. It revolved around tracking lost relics, navigating ancient ruins, dismantling traps, bypassing magical defenses, and recovering priceless artifacts. Nobles, guilds, governments, everyone wanted a vault seeker on their payroll. With that class, Jensen wouldn't just be valuable. He'd be a kingmaker. So, what's the problem? Torwin asked. You know what that class is worth. Jensen nodded. But it doesn't fit my father's plan. He wants me close to home. I could be a vault seeker for him, sure, but not as his son. He wants a legacy, not a loose cannon. That explains why he was fine with Ranger, Torwin said. Prestige. Something you could claim without risking too much. Enhance the family name from a safe distance. Exactly, Jensen muttered. Torwin looked at him thoughtfully. Taking this class puts you at odds with your family. But not taking it, that's walking away from the opportunity of a lifetime. Jensen looked down. I know. You won't need your father's money, Jensen. With this class, you'll make your own. You'll have people lining up to fund your expeditions. Within 5 years, you'll be wealthier than your family ever dreamed. I want to do it, Jensen said softly. But you've met him. Torwin chuckled. No, actually, I haven't. I was handed your apprenticeship after the deal was signed. Didn't have a say in it. No offense. None taken, Jensen said dryly. But I will say this, you don't have the disposition for Ranger, and that's nothing to be ashamed of. You do have the instincts for this. And if you want my help voiding the guild contract, you've got it. But talking to your father? That's on you. Jensen went pale. He's not an easy man. Neither are vaults, Torwin replied. You're going to face worse than an angry noble with a bloated ego. If you're going to walk this path, you need to prove to yourself that you can. Jensen was silent for a long moment. Then, quietly, I can do this. I'm my own man. He doesn't own me. No flash of light. No burst of sound. But something changed his posture. Spine straightening, jaw firm. Jensen Alderworth, level 20. Class, Vault Seeker. Stats, 71 pH, 36 Mi, 50 Mi. Skills, Tracking 5, Marksman 4, Empty. Torwin read the new status and smiled. Looks like I won't be your mentor for much longer. Jensen chuckled. Probably not. While I've got you, though, any advice on what skill to take first? Definitely something that can synergize with tracking. A treasure sensing skill, maybe. Look for options that mention resonance or detection. Anything that might merge down the line. They spoke in quiet tones for a while longer, discussing optimal skill paths and tactical strategies. And as Torwin looked at the young man before him, no longer a wide-eyed apprentice, but someone claiming his future, he felt something warm stir in his chest. Pride. The boy had stepped out of the shadow cast by expectation and into the light of self-determination. And for an old ranger, there was no greater legacy than that. Velik felt it the moment the sun dipped below the horizon, even without laying eyes on the sky for 3 days. It was subtle at first, a lightness in his limbs, the sluggish ache of endless fighting easing like a blade drawn from a sheath. The scorpions that had been harrying him for hours suddenly seemed slow, clumsy, predictable. You have advanced to level 34. +2 physical, +1 mental, +2 free points. Without hesitation, he dropped both free points and a mystic. He'd been doing that for several levels now, though he was starting to question the logic. Phalanx, useful as it was, hadn't become what he'd hoped. A defensive skill with potential, yes, but it hadn't grown into the reactive, riposte-based ability he'd wanted it to be. He'd gambled on shaping it with use and lost. Still, Duskbound was active now. His strength surged. His vision sharpened. It was time. The flood of monsters had slowed. Either they were running out of bodies, or they were trying to lull him into complacency. He doubted they were capable of the latter. They'd already been winning the war of attrition. No need for tricks. If his assumption was right, that he'd cleared most of this infestation, and with the cave entrances still sealed behind those translucent membranes that sprayed acidic gas when punctured, then only one path remained, forward. He turned toward the cave. No more stalling. If there's a champion elite in there, it ends tonight. There was still no sign of the assassin Scorpling, the one that had vanished after their initial clash. No surprise. Velik wasn't making the same mistakes twice, and the creature had probably given up trying to get the drop on him. He stood at the mouth of the cavern, the one he discovered days ago, the one he suspected was the champion's lair. Should have just gone in back then, but that would have meant fighting all these monsters after entering unfamiliar terrain. At least this way, he'd thinned the numbers on ground he understood, fleshy, stinking, and hostile as it was. And by now, he was starting to think he was trapped in a dungeon. Torwin had once told him that champion seeds were rare because most champions lived inside dungeons, and the only way to get their seed was to destroy the dungeon itself. If this room held a champion and didn't drop a seed, he'd have his confirmation. Another good reason to see this through. Not for glory, not even greed, just practicality. Monster hunting gear didn't come cheap, and after Jensen had rattled off the costs, Velik had realized that grinding Dekarmos one kill at a time wasn't going to cut it. One step at a time. First, kill whatever's inside. He listened at the threshold. Silence. If there were any scorplings lurking, they were well hidden. This was his best shot at an uninterrupted champion fight. The cavern opened wide into a dome-shaped arena, nearly 200 feet across with a ceiling 50 feet high. The same veiny, pulsing flesh coated the walls and floor. He'd peered in from this spot more than once before. It looked just as empty now as it always had. Velik stepped into the center, spear in hand, every sense alert. You have entered the domain of a champion elite, Scalethex, the broodmother. Thought so. But where is it? The floor twitched. A ripple moved through the flesh, and at the chamber's center, it swelled, bulging like something underneath was pressing up. Then the surface tore. A claw, black, chitinous, longer than Velik was tall, punched through. Then another. Within seconds, a monster the size of a barn slithered from the hole. Velik blinked. Oh, that's where it is. Also, why is it so damn big? Scalethex looked like every other scorpling he'd fought. Same shiny carapace, same toothless, sensory dead maw, but scaled up to the size of a small house. The tail alone looked like it could skewer a wagon. If it got a clean hit with that stinger, it wouldn't just pierce, it'd impale. It lunged forward, pincer spread. Velik ran to meet it. The thing actually paused, confused by his aggressive charge. That hesitation cost it dearly. Velik slipped inside its reach, spear blazing with kinetic charge. He jammed the weapon into the creature's gaping maw, shattering fang-like protrusions. Power surged through the shaft, detonating inside the monster's face. As Velik dragged the blade free, he reshaped the tip into a jagged saw, ripping through tissue and tendon. Scalethex shrieked and went wild. One pincer slammed into Velik's legs, sending him tumbling across the spongy ground. He landed hard, rolled, and rose, only to be swatted again by a second wild strike. It's not even targeting me, it's just flailing. Velik stumbled back, annoyed more than hurt. The beast wasn't strategic. It wasn't even trying. It was having a tantrum. He sidestepped another blow and watched as the massive body careened, spraying black ichor across the floor. It was hard to take seriously, until he noticed something new. The floor was splitting, not from the champion's thrashing, but something beneath. Something peeling back the fleshy surface from inside. Velik narrowed his eyes. A long, obsidian stinger pierced the furrow the champion had carved. A smaller scorpling crawled free, slick with gore. Then another, and another. In seconds, Velik counted at least 20 more. Oh no, they were trapped under the floor. Buried alive. Protected. Waiting. That's why it's called the Brood Mother. The newborns were vulnerable, still cutting their way out, but the champion's erratic rampage made it impossible to approach safely. The first scorpling broke free and charged. For more followed. Velik raised his spear. So much for an uninterrupted fight.
Hey, welcome to Firescale Audiobooks. If you enjoy our audiobooks, please consider subscribing to the channel. Also, feel free to share your review in the comments section below.
As many scorplings as he'd killed, Velik didn't have much trouble keeping up with the waves chasing him down. He was nimble enough to keep them from reaching him in groups larger than 2 or 3, but there were some issues avoiding the champion elite. It still hadn't focused its attention on him. It was still bleeding profusely from the single wound he'd dealt it. If that was enough to kill it, It'd be the easiest champion he'd fought so far. He wasn't betting on it, though. So, while he dealt with the smaller scorplings that kept tearing their way up through rents in the floor, he was on the lookout for another good opening. The problem with that was that the damn thing never stopped moving, and it was so unpredictable that even approaching it was a good way to get swatted across the cavern again. And then it did something so unexpected. Velik wasn't sure he'd actually seen what he thought he'd seen. The champion staggered drunkenly to the left, bringing its mouth in line with the corpse of one of the smaller scorplings, seemingly through sheer coincidence. When it finished the pass, the body was gone. Did it just eat that monster? If so, he was dead certain that no good could come from that. Champions always had weird, unique skills, and consuming corpses sounded exactly like one of those. The only question in his mind was how many it needed to eat and what exactly it would do with them once it reached that number. Not killing the scorplings wasn't really an option, however. If he didn't keep their numbers under control, they'd overwhelm him. That meant he needed to be more proactive in attacking the champion before it could do whatever it was building up to. Just standing back and letting it slowly bleed out was no longer an option. Velik quickly slew the scorpling in front of him with a kinetic charge to split it down the center, then turned and sprinted toward the broodmother. It was scooping up another body in its mouth and swallowing it whole. Is this thing immune to their venom, too? I guess that makes sense, maybe, just as he reached the monster. Rather than try to dance his way through its scrambling legs and flailing pincers, Velik jumped for the monster's back. Normally, he wouldn't even have considered that idea, not with that stinger the size of a broad sword looming overhead, but he liked his odds of dodging that better than the rest of its limbs. A new problem reared its head once he regained his balance. Scorplings were tough, even for him. He'd learned to find the weak spots in their exoskeletons and could rely on kinetic charge to muscle through if needed, but punching through their carapaces without a care wasn't an option. Against the giant champion version, even the weak spots were hard to do more than just scratch. Kinetic charge took some time to build up, and he'd just used the last of the skill's reserves on the scorpling he'd killed before charging the broodmother. In an effort to hurry it up, he pushed the skill as hard as he could, while putting his spear through a simple routine, which wasn't as easy as it sounded when he had to do it on the back of a giant, squirming bug monster. Something started growing out of the monster's exoskeleton, like a massive flesh sack big enough for him to crawl into that had seeped out from between the joints in its armor. Whatever that was, it looked soft and squishy, and Velik immediately darted forward to skewer it. Before he got there, the champion's stinger flashed down in front of him. Forced to dodge to one side, he was too late to stop it from rupturing on its own. A fresh scorpling crouched on the broodmother's back, easily the largest one he'd ever seen aside from the champion itself. It didn't hesitate to scuttle toward Velik, who was busy dodging the broodmother's tail stinger coming down at him again. It wasn't terribly accurate, but he supposed when it was that big, it didn't much need to be. A second flesh sac started to swell up behind the scorpling, and a third one near that. Is that all this thing does? Make more monsters? That's not terrible, I guess, but it's going to make for a long, tedious fight. Just as Velik was thinking that, the first scorpling opened its mouth. Immediately, a high-speed stream of acid arced through the air. Velik's eyes widened for half a second as the startlingly accurate shot sped right at his face. Frantically, he ducked and shielded his face with one arm. Fiery pinpricks of pain dotted the exposed skin, but being burnt was nothing new down here. Before the scorpling could fry him, he lunged forward and stabbed his spear into its body. It didn't penetrate far, certainly not enough to kill the monster, but that was more than enough to grab the spear's haft with both hands and lift. The scorpling rose into the air, its legs kicking and flailing wildly, and he whipped the spear into an overhead slash that saw the monster flying free to smash into the wall of the cavern 50 feet away. The broodmother's tail came down again, not slamming into its own back, but in a sweeping motion that threatened to scoop him up and, if not bisect him cleanly, at least throw him back to the ground where he'd be in range of its legs and pincers. Luckily for Velik, it was trying not to knock the monsters it had spawned off too, so the sweep was high enough for him to duck under. He let the blade of his spear drag across the tail as it swished by, but that was just as heavily armored as the rest of the monster. He might have left a scratch across its length. It was there and gone too fast for him to tell. Then the two scorplings that had grown out of the sacks on its back tore their way free and focused on Velik. Okay, I need to find some way to go on the offensive. Other than that opening strike to the mouth, I haven't hurt this thing yet. There's got to be another weak point that doesn't involve getting trampled or sliced in two trying to reach it. Fuck, why do these champions always have such heavy armor? He knew the reason, of course. It was because monsters like these weren't supposed to be fought solo. Whole teams win at champions, including people with specialized builds to tie up a monster's attention or to blow it to pieces with magic. All he had for magic was phalanx, and that was even less useful than his normal attacks. Less useful, but not useless entirely. New sacks were already ballooning up, 6 of them now, while the 2 scorplings clicked and hissed at him. Unwilling to take a chance at getting shot with a stream of acid, he summoned all 4 spears and used them to harry the monsters while he closed the distance. This was a losing strategy for him, not because it didn't work, but because the broodmother had half a dozen more ready to go with even more of those strange sacks growing out of the joints in its armored back. Though he wasn't sure how the ability worked exactly, he thought it must have something to do with the bodies it had already consumed. Even if it could create a new scorpling for each one it ate, it was amazing that it did the work so fast. This thing has got to be cheating somehow. It couldn't just recycle its minions forever. There had to be some sort of inefficiency in the process somewhere, but if it was small enough, that could leave Velik killing the same monsters 1,000 times just to defeat this one ability. There had to be some way to kill the broodmother directly, but his spear wasn't cutting it. Even with its boost to legendary quality, he didn't have the physical needed to actually hurt the damn thing. Kinetic Charge was finally ready to use again, but just before he could activate it, he saw something interesting. The flesh sacks containing the regrown scorplings would grow, then they'd tear themselves free. The sacks would fall off, and in the spot where they'd been attached to the champion, there was no armor plating. Finally, a weakness. The next 3 minutes were among the most chaotic of Velik's life. He put every single point of his stats to work controlling not only his own body, but the 4 spears of phalanx to keep the scorpling swarm from tearing him apart. It wasn't worth the effort to try to kill them, so he settled for knocking them back and pinning them down until he was past. Scorplings came at him from every direction, some big, others small. Lines of acid shot through the air, the monsters uncaring if they hit each other. 2 of the tiniest ones had oversized pincers that produced sharp blades of wind each time they snapped them at him. Those were dangerous enough that Velik had to kill them rather than try to ignore them. Eventually, he made it through the wave of monsters to where new ones were growing. With a vicious kick, Velik separated one of the sacks from the broodmother. Then he drove his spear straight down into the open hole in its back. The result was immediate. The champion let out a chittering screech of what Velik assumed was pain and spun in place so fast that better than half the scorplings went flying. Velik himself only held his position by using the spear still anchored in the monster's body as a handhold. Now we're getting somewhere, he thought with a savage grin. As far as defensive traits went, sheer size was a good one. Even with a vulnerability identified and in reach, Velik lacked the range to give the broodmother a deep, fatal wound. The champion elite was by far the largest monster he'd ever fought. The fake Velik was a close second, but it just didn't have the massive solidity this champion displayed. His spear dug deep, the half fully 3 feet inside the broodmother, but it was spinning about so wildly in an attempt to throw him off that if he dared pull the weapon back out, he'd go flying. None of the scorplings were still on the champion's back with him, though, so some good had come of this latest development. Some of the other flesh sacks had been ripped free as well, leaving more exposures in need of stabbing. Unable to physically cross the distance to get to them, Velik quickly sent a few spears from phalanx to stab into the broodmother. Unlike his actual weapon, none of them dug more than a foot in. One of them didn't even make it that far, having been dislodged by a new scorpling sack growing out of the opening just as it started to stab into the soft flesh on the champion's back. At the same time, its tail's stinger slashed across his back, this time scraping so low that Velik had no choice but to leap over it. Regaining his footing after he landed was a problem for the Velik that would exist 5 seconds in the future. Right now, avoiding being cut in half was his only priority. He wrenched his spear free, tensed his legs, and leaped straight up, a standing jump that brought him close to 15 feet in the air. The stinger flashed below him, scraping 5 or 6 new budding scorpling sacs off the monster's back and shattering the phantasmal spears stuck into it in the process. Though he was more focused on nailing a successful landing, he heard the wet splat of those sacs striking the wall 50 feet away. Could I survive that? Even if I did, would I be in any shape to fight after? Unlike most of the other champions he'd fought, this one hadn't sealed its domain off. He could probably make a run for it and get away. It wasn't like a monster that big could follow him into the tunnels. Its brood might have some weird skills, but he could handle that. His only fear was that those invisible walls that blocked his route back to the surface were keeping him trapped in here, too. There was no convenient way to test that, not from his position about to land back on the massive scorpling's back, so he put the thought aside and focused on not getting thrown before he could establish his grip again. Besides, he didn't want to run. He wanted to kill this thing, and that was what he was going to do. His spear led his descent, not perfectly lined up to strike, but still his best shot. It drove hard against the brood mother's black armor, backed by kinetic charge, and for a second, he thought the added momentum and weight of coming down on the monster was going to be what he needed to finally push through. The tip dug in all of an inch or two, then slid sideways, leaving a long scratch in its wake and costing Velik his balance. Damn it! He screamed internally as his hips slammed into the monster and he started to roll. There was no purchase to be found, and in a fraction of a second, he'd be thrown out into the open air. Desperate, he did the only thing he could think of. He summoned phalanx and planted the spears in his path the same way he'd used them on countless monsters to block their attacks. Phalanx has advanced to rank 4. That was an unexpected bonus, but Velik really didn't have time to consider the ramifications right then. His boots slammed into the bar of softly glowing light with enough force that it barely slowed him down before shattering. 2 more behind it also broke, but the 4th one held long enough for him to scramble back to his feet just before he would have gone over the edge. That did not make it easy to maintain his perch, not with the brood mother still turning like crazy in giant circles. Doesn't this thing get dizzy eventually? It's been spinning for at least a few minutes now. Then again, it didn't have eyes, so maybe whatever senses it used weren't affected by its crazy gyrations. Moving with the spin to help him keep his balance, he stutter-stepped forward, hopping every few feet to try to reset his balance. The strategy didn't work very well, but he still managed to reach one of the sacs spawning gaps in the broodmother's armor. With both hands, he slammed the tip of his spear down. Flesh wound it might have been, but the brood mother still felt it. The chittering scream started up again, and its flailing took on a new dimension. No longer content to just spin and flail in random directions, the monster went into a series of short hops that almost dislodged Velik's spear from her back. "Come on, just die already!" he screamed back, driving the spear in deeper. The giant scorpling didn't oblige. Velik pulled on phalanx for all he could get, and was surprised to see an extra spear materialize this time. With barely a thought, he directed them to slam into every sac vent he could find. Black blood streamed from the wounds, but it wasn't enough. The wounds were too shallow. "I don't need 5 small spears. I need one huge one. Come on, work with me, you piece of shit skill." Growling, he summoned a new spear and stabbed it into the scorpling's back. Then he made another one and slammed it down on top of the first one. It split the spear down the middle, tearing through it and banishing it, only to take its place. "Combine! Do it!" Another spear formed and shot down. It might have been his imagination, or he could have lost track of it for a moment as the scorpling abruptly changed the direction it was turning. But for a split second, he thought he saw the spear grow bigger before it broke. Again, phalanx hammered that spot as fast as he could make new spears. They broke, reformed, merged, and split back apart. The skill resisted him, but then it always had. What he needed from it wasn't what it wanted to do. but he was sick of it. It was time for the skill to merge or break. The light from phalanx intensified as the spear stuck in the scorpion grew bigger. It drove deeper and deeper, but it still wasn't enough. The monster was too big. He needed to drive at least 10 feet down, and the spears weren't even that long. Even with the partial size boost he'd managed to drag out of the spears, they didn't have the penetrating power. No, he growled, his knuckles white from gripping his own spear just to hold his place. Work! Work, damn you! The next spear got empowered with kinetic charge, and when it slammed home, there was an explosion of light. The brood mother screamed loud enough to deafen Velik, and a geyser of black blood shot up high enough to paint the ceiling. Kinetic charge has been folded into phalanx. Phalanx has become dreadlance. Dreadlance set to rank 1. It wasn't what Velik had wanted from the skill when he'd picked it, but it was exactly what he needed right now. Knowledge of its function was instantly at the forefront of his mind. With barely a thought, he ripped his spear out and activated the skill. Light bloomed around the length of the shaft as it was imbued with energy, all of it coursing down to build up at the tip. That was an element of kinetic charge. There, he knew. It felt the exact same. But when he went to strike, his spear hit with explosive force. The head buried itself deep, far deeper than any of his previous strikes. The spear went in 5 feet, then 6, to the point where there was barely any of the shaft left for him to hold on to. Then the mystical energy surged downward and exploded outward. Chunks of exoskeleton, meat, and blood bounced off the ceiling to rain down on the floor of the cave, and Velik himself was thrown clear of the broodmother. Its underbelly slammed into the ground, cracking apart 2 legs and splaying the rest in the process. A cascade of notifications hit him, dozens of kills all at once. Must have crushed a bunch of scorpions underneath it when it collapsed, he thought somewhat woozily. It took him a moment to realize that, despite the massive wound in its back, somehow the broodmother was still alive. It was definitely down for the moment, but it kept twitching, and none of his kill notifications included a champion elite. Of more immediate concern was the fact that his spear was nowhere in sight, and there were still a few dozen scorpions on the ground, all of them heading his way. Velik climbed to his feet and tried to clear his vision with a few rapid blinks, but things still swam across his eyes. With no time to waste, he did his best to circle the incoming swarm and reach the broodmother, but they didn't go out of their way to make it easy. At one point, he ended up jumping up to a wall and kicking off it just to get around a trio that were blocking his progress. The broodmother twitched feebly as he approached. Velik had a brief thought that it was trying to attack him, but then he realized the truth. It was eating the corpse of one of its scorpions. It's still trying to make more of them? Why? But that wasn't it. Even as he watched, the massive wound on its back started to heal. It twitched its mouth, dragging another nearby corpse in, and consumed that too. Hell no, he said. We're not doing this all again. He quickly located his spear, somehow still stuck in the scorpion's back, and climbed up to jerk it free. Then he started charging up Dreadlance again. When it was ready a minute later, he leaped down directly in front of the scorpion's mouth, thrust the spear in, and unleashed the built-up power. There was still a lot of collateral damage, and he got absolutely coated with scorpion chum, but he was still smiling when he saw the next set of notifications. You have slain Scalethex the Broodmother, Champion Elite, level 40. You have advanced to level 35. +2 physical, +1 mental, +2 free points. Velik ended up spending another hour taking care of the remaining scorpions. Rather than fight them in the cavern, he retreated to the tunnels again and ambushed them in small groups as they spread out to look for him. The fights were challenging more in that he hadn't slept in days and was exhausted from killing that champion, but he still got the job done. It was only once he was finally safe again that he realized he hadn't received a champion seed for killing the giant scorpion. As far as he was concerned, that was confirmation that he was in a dungeon, which meant if he didn't hurry, there was a possibility that the champion would appear again. He didn't really understand how the mechanics of its mana recycling process worked, but the fact that the monsters didn't stay dead was common knowledge, which means no matter how many of these monsters I kill, there will always be more. But I could break those damn invisible walls now. Dreadlance truly did solve all the problems he'd been having since coming to the Deepwood. He'd leveled up several times and gotten a nice bonus to his physical when he'd upgraded his spear, but the champions were still so tough that even injuring them was a daunting proposition. The skill was not without its drawbacks, namely that it was exhausting to use. Even the 2 shots he'd unloaded into the Broodmother had left him feeling winded like he was coming off a 6-hour sprint. The skill also took a minute or so to charge to full power, and trying to hold it there for very long was an exercise in futility. But it did turn his mystic stat into a true powerhouse, stacking it right on top of his physical and releasing all that energy in an explosive burst. He hadn't had the opportunity to test it out yet, but he was reasonably certain that it could catch multiple enemies in the detonation if they were close enough together. Of course, if he wasn't careful, he could also easily injure himself, so it was sure to be a tricky skill to manage. Retreat or press forward? He wondered to himself after he'd finished hunting down the Scorplings. On the one hand, he was tired and sore. He finally had a way free, and a large part of him demanded he take it. On the other hand, he still had plenty of healing potions and his haste potion, and if he left now, he'd have to kill the Broodmother again when he came back. He'd already checked the compass and confirmed that his target was still here, or maybe that here was the target if he was right about this place being a dungeon. If that was the case, then it was the source of the monsters. An undiscovered dungeon hundreds of miles from civilization, just far enough away to never be detected, but close enough to threaten the frontier, was exactly the kind of problem that could account for the monsters constantly filtering out of the wildlands. And that meant, now that he knew where it was, that the smart thing to do was to flee, report the location, and let the experts dismantle it. But if he did that, he would never get the answers he needed. Challen was somewhere out here, tied to these monsters somehow, maybe a monster himself. Maybe he was this dungeon, and if so, maybe it was possible to free him somehow. A dungeon cracker team wouldn't bother to try. They'd slaughter the monsters, break the core, loot the place, and pat themselves on the back. Is it worth risking your life? Over? It was a decision he could put off for a few more minutes while he made a different one. Thanks to the skill merger, he had an open slot to fill. Dreadlance had been an entirely unexpected acquisition, and it changed what he needed by functioning as a high-damage skill. Ideally, he'd like to test it on a group of enemies, but not when the stakes were so high, and especially not in such tight confines where he had to worry about turning a monster into shrapnel. The question was whether it functioned as a multi-target skill, but Velik wasn't sure that even mattered anymore. He'd wanted a skill for large groups of monsters. Now he'd fought hundreds of groups like that, and he'd found his own natural skills up to the task. His coordination and timing were flawless, and his speed and raw power were more than enough to put down anything even 5 levels above him, as long as it wasn't an elite. And if it was, now he had Dreadlance to crack its shell. In light of that, he had to take a moment to think about what he really needed. More offense never hurt, but utility skill might make more of a difference. The biggest threats to his life right now were a lack of shelter and water. He couldn't safely rest, and at some point, dehydration would overcome the limits of a 107 physical. It wouldn't be today, but it would happen eventually. But he wasn't planning on being in the flesh caves that long. So, if he dismissed a survivability skill option that left him with offense, defense, speed, or expanding to rely more heavily on his slowly growing mystic stat. Offense and speed were fine, sort of. It would be nice to tear apart champions 10 levels higher than him with nothing but his spear, but it wasn't necessary. Maybe something to resist environmental damage, like that burning air that comes out of the walls when I damage them. I can always dodge a bite, but how do you avoid the air around you trying to melt your skin? The Black Fang, as a class, didn't have much in the way of defensive skills. It was focused on hitting hard and hitting first, not on trading blows, but there were a few options in the general skills list, depending on what he was looking to fortify himself against. Mind Fortress helped to insulate him from any sort of mind control or illusions, but he already had that amulet Torwin had given him. Thermal Regulation helped with extreme temperatures, and he found something called inert matter that he didn't really understand, but which claimed to help resist chemical alterations to his body. Ivory Bones was a contender in that it strengthened his whole skeleton, but that wasn't really what he needed. The problem with any of those was that he didn't really see them merging with his current skills. Nothing in his list played nice with the idea of just taking a blow, be it by tooth, or by flame, or by chemical alteration, whatever that meant. If he took one of those 4 skills, that was likely to be the basis of a new skill to start building on. So he wanted to be sure it was the right one. Or he could go the other direction and grab something else that was powered by Mystic. There were a few utility class skills that used it, but they all felt so situational that he felt like he'd have the same problem. Whatever he took wouldn't have a prayer of merging into any of his current skills. Either I'm starting a new branch in my build, and I'll have to wait until I hit level 40 to pick up something to advance it with, or I need to take something that I can fold into what I've got now, which may not be immediately useful. Really, it comes down to whether I should be building for the future or for the problem in front of me, and I already know the answer to that. Spear Warden was his highest ranked skill, which meant if he merged something into it, he was practically guaranteed to get an extremely powerful skill, maybe even something to rival Apex Hunter. If he'd been able to rank up Kinetic Charge or Phalanx a few more times, he could only imagine how strong the skill he'd have gotten instead of Dreadlance would have been. That brought him back to considering Savage Rhythm again. He could see it merging with either Spear Warden or Dreadlance, and while it wasn't useful for a quick skirmish, if he was going to keep hunting champion elites, it wasn't a terrible choice. It didn't give him armor penetration, but not every champion was so tough that he couldn't hurt it with a normal attack. A lot of them are, though, even if it's only because they're always a higher level than me. Maybe this is a skill better left for later, but it would be so useful if I could merge it into Spear Warden. All right, let's go with that. Maybe it'll help cut apart these packs of Scorplings I keep running into, too. Decision made. He added Savage Rhythm to his skill list. New knowledge flooded his mind. Ways he'd never considered to build off each successive strike until an opponent was completely overwhelmed in an avalanche of blows, or to chain one attack into another against a different enemy. The skill was actually more flexible than he'd given it credit for prior to choosing it, and he was hopeful that he wouldn't regret the choice like he had with Phalanx. There was an easy way to find out. With an eager grin stretching his lips, he started hunting for his first group of victims. Sildra had been impressed with Jensen's work. He was quick, decisive, and devastatingly accurate with that bow of his. When the monsters had threatened to overwhelm them, he'd magically pulled something out of nowhere to turn the battle around. She'd been quite taken by his performance. Then she'd accompanied Torwin to Beldrit the night he'd returned. He'd needed her Eye of the Moon skill to confirm the corrupted seed-bearers were entirely purged, and her quest had evolved from saving Dishur to encompassing the entirety of the frontier. It was immediately obvious what the difference was between a gold-ranked monster hunter and his young apprentice. He had arrows in the air even before she could open her mouth to let him know a monster was approaching. How high is this man's mental stat to not only hear everything around him, but to be able to track them through the brush? He has to have at least a couple of skills helping him along. They reached Beldrit after a short hour of travel, and Sildra caught her breath upon coming in range. There are at least 20 or 30 monsters inside the walls, she informed Torwin. Probably more under the roofs, he said. We'll have to drag everyone out house by house to make sure we've got them all. That wasn't going to go well, but then again, the people of Dishur had been far more pliable than she'd expected after she and Jensen had rescued them. She expected that had more to do with the more recalcitrant elements of the town being dead than anything, either because they'd resisted the invaders or because they'd been part of the attack. Beldrit was in better condition, but things were still tense. They'd survived the initial assault, but a quarter of the town had been killed, and they had no way to know how many monsters still lurked among them. No way to know if a man who'd been on the side of humanity yesterday was still himself now. Sildra could tell, though. It was only a question of whether they believe her. No woman wanted to hear that her son had been killed and replaced by a monster. No husband would believe that his wife was working with the body snatchers, not even in the face of overwhelming evidence. That, more than anything, was what made it so hard to quell the invasion. People just wouldn't do what was needed when the victims were their families. At least, that was how things had gone in Dishur. When they walked through the open, unmanned gates of Beldred an hour or two before midnight, they immediately found a crowd gathered in the middle of town, loudly arguing. "I'm telling you, you're wrong. I think I'd know if my own brother had been replaced by a monster." "Then what was he doing in my house?" another man yelled back. Torwin turned a questioning gaze to Sildra, and she shook her head. There were 6 corrupted sea-bearers in the crowd, but the man in question wasn't one of them. Whatever it was he'd been up to in his neighbor's home, it wasn't to spread more corruption through Beldred. "Which ones?" the old monster hunter asked. "There, the bald one with the scar under his eye. And there, the young man with the long hair in the faded green coat. There, to his left, the girl with her hair in braids." Sildra choked for a moment as she pointed Torwin there. The girl couldn't be more than 12. She took a moment to compose herself, then pointed out the remaining monsters. "There can't be any mistakes," Torwin said. "Make sure you're sure." "I am," she told him with a firm voice. "It would be better if the blame for this falls squarely on me. When this job is over, I'll be gone, and everyone who wants someone to blame for the death of whoever was important to them can point their anger at me. When the rest of them make their move, just keep your calls under your breath. Do not worry, I will hear you." "Your ears are truly that sharp?" she murmured, practically inaudibly. He grinned and said, "They are." And then that terrifying bow of his came up, and an arrow appeared out of nowhere, already set on its string. Torwin killed all 6 of the monsters before the first scream started. Then he pushed his way through the crowd to where 2 men held a third by the arms and had him pushed down on his knees. "This one is no monster," he said. "At least, not one recognized by the system. Whatever he was doing, it was of his own free will and not because he is a corpse puppet controlled by a seed of corruption." "Who the hell are you?" the accusing man demanded. "The hunter," Torwin said simply. "And a damn good thing I'm the one who came out here. The scope of this infestation is far greater than your towns reported. No bronze-ranked monster hunter could have handled this threat, despite the fact that my apprentice and I have killed thousands of monsters over this last month. More and more keep showing up. This is an absolute disaster, and now your towns are infested with monsters the likes of which I've never seen. I am here to purge this corruption, and by Morgus, that is exactly what I'm going to do." The crowd surged, screams of denials and raw, primal hatred ringing out. Sildra worried briefly, not for Torwin, but for the townsfolk who were trying to reach him. If he felt threatened, she didn't know what he'd do. No, he wouldn't hurt the people he'd been hired to protect, not on purpose. A new monster appeared in the square, a middle-aged man with a lumberjack's axe held loosely in one hand. He stood in the front door of a house and gazed casually at the commotion. Before he could take another step, Sildra whispered, "To your left, just past the crowd. Dark hair, dirty skin, holding an axe on his right side." It seemed impossible that Torwin could have heard her, but somehow, impossibly, his bow snapped up and a new arrow manifested, its tip held in line with his finger. A fresh round of screams went up, but too late to warn the imposter. The arrow flew true, lacing its way through the startled faces of the crowd to sink into the monster's face. It took him between the eyes, sending up a gout of blood and dropping the monster straight to the ground. "The whole village will assemble in front of me so that I might sift out the monsters among you," Torwin yelled, his voice pitched to be heard over the crowd. "Every last one of you, and if anyone thinks to hide in their cellars or attics, know that I will drag you out myself." Despite any protest to the contrary, Torwin bullied the entire town into doing exactly that. After the first few kills, he answered calls to prove he wasn't just killing random citizens by claiming a machete and shoving it into the mayor's hand. "There," he said, "this man here is a monster in human skin. Execute him yourself and see the system message." Despite protests to the contrary, Torwin had no mercy for the man and bullied him into it. At the same time, a group of 6 monsters burst out of the inn, axes raised overhead as they charged the crowd. Sildra started to draw on her power, to use lunar flare to cut them down, but Torwin put arrows through them all. His eyes shifted to Sildra for a moment and took in her slight nod. His features hardened, and he gestured to the group. "There are 6 more for you. Kill them and see for yourself." "No, not my boy," A woman cried, rushing forward. She was older, perhaps 40 or 50, and attempted to throw herself in front of a young man in his early 20s who was clutching at an arrow lodged firmly in his leg, just above his knee. His face was twisted up in a grimace of pain. "Mom," he gasped out. "We can't let him. He's a monster. Must stop him." More protests rang out. More townsfolk rushed to defend the monsters wearing the bodies of their loved ones. Torwin was merciless, so much so that he pulled a dagger from his belt and demanded a random man hold one of the monsters up. Forced to comply, he held his struggling neighbor while Torwin slit the monster's throat. "You have helped slay a corrupted seed-bearer, level 15, the man who'd restrained the monster said, his voice breaking halfway through. Gods, he was right. Despite any cries of protest or attempts to stop him, Torwin did his job. It was a grim, bloody harvest, one no one thanked him for, but in the end, every last man, woman, and child was examined thoroughly. Those that tried to hide failed to veil themselves from Torwin's senses and were dragged out under the moonlight for Sildra to covertly examine. Veldrit hated him for it, just as he'd told her they would. There were some who understood the necessity, maybe even most, but Sildra knew it would be weeks and months before they accepted the reality of the tragedy, that these monsters were no different than the ones who dragged their victims off into the trees to eat them alive, that their family members were already dead. And then it was over in just 2 short hours. It was like a nightmare she hadn't realized she was trapped in until she woke back up. For a few brief minutes, she was just thankful that the job was done. Then she remembered the truth. Veldrit was only the first town on their run tonight. Banner ad, a week in the life of user ad. Velik paused in front of the corpse of the scorpling brood mother. There was less of it there, somehow like the dungeon itself was slowly reclaiming it. He didn't have time to stand and watch, but he imagined an invisible mouth taking tiny little bites out of the monster, just nibbling away until it reached the inevitable conclusion. He wondered if the dungeon was feeding the seed mana directly from the monster in front of him, and more importantly, how long it would take for a new one to grow. Will it be this big from the beginning, or will it need months and months to grow after it comes back? Either way, it was widely known that the smaller, normal enemies would return in a matter of days at most, maybe less. If he wanted to finish up here and get out without having to fight his way clear, he needed to hurry. With that thought in mind, he strode past the champion's corpse and deeper into the darkness. One thing he hadn't anticipated was that without phalanx to provide the faintest amount of light, he was now wholly reliant on his hood's night vision to see again. That made it harder to track the scorplings, but he was confident he was done with that part of the dungeon anyway. It was obvious the broodmother was the source of those, and barring any strays still wandering around, he'd slaughtered the whole population. The tunnels on the other side of the broodmother's cave looked almost exactly like the ones he'd explored near the surface, except the skin layer was thicker and had a pattern of thick black veins running through it. Or maybe they're pink, for all I know. Not like I can see colors down here. The tunnels got smaller the deeper he went until he came to a point where there was only a foot wide opening. Unwilling to leave himself so vulnerable to monster attack, Velik backtracked and started hunting for a different way forward. Inevitably, he found nothing but dead ends. Impossible. There has to be something bigger than that. Else how would the monsters get through? But as he thought that, he found himself remembering the centipedes. It was easy enough to picture them slipping through the crevice without incident. The scorplings came from the broodmother, which explained how they'd filled the caves, but didn't help him delve deeper into the dungeon. The more he looked, the more certain he became that his only way forward was to squeeze his way through. After a few hours, with no other options, he returned to the crevice and paused outside of it. The fleshy walls had give, so if necessary, he could cut his way free. The real threat was a monster coming up on him while he was squirming through. All was silent, though. If there was a monster nearby, it was out of sight and completely, utterly still. Velik waited for a minute, not even breathing while he waited. Finally, he hefted his spear, shortening the shaft down to 2 feet in length, and slipped into the crevice. Ugh, why is it so warm? It was bad enough that it was squishy, but the strange heat was disturbing on a whole different level. He hadn't noticed it so much when the tunnels were wide enough that he couldn't touch both walls. But as they narrowed and the fleshy membrane covering cold stone squeezed around him, the warmth became inescapable. Velik turned sideways to fit his shoulders deeper in, his spear in his leading hand. If anything did come at him from the other side, he'd be able to shove a piece of sharpened metal at it at least. 10 feet in, the gap stopped getting narrower, but now he was pressed so tight that only his high physical stat let him force a breath into his lungs. Any thoughts that the pliable nature of the walls would let him squeeze through vanished. A hot, moist breeze misted his exposed skin, then vanished. Velik froze, then started to shuffle back a step. At the same time, a thick rope of black vein in front of him shifted, splitting open and blasting him with a cloud of fetid stink. Is that a... There were no teeth, but the tongue was unmistakable as it pierced through the darkness and slammed into his chest. It was easily a foot wide, long and flexible. Without hesitation, Velik drove his spear into the meat of it, causing the tongue to recoil, but pulling him with it. It wasn't yet wrapped around him, but it already had enough of a grip to take him off his feet. Blood flowed smoothly from several stab wounds in the next half a second as both Velik's hands went to work. His right hand held his spear, shortened to stab in tight confines, and his left snaked around to pull the hunting knife from his belt so that he could start hacking through the meat of the massive tongue. He was pulled 6 feet into the wall, or rather into the gaping mouth that had opened there, and now the teeth were visible. Rather than being large, knife-like protrusions, they were instead hundreds and hundreds of little things, no more than an inch or 2 long. He could easily picture the mouth constricting around him like some sort of torture device, grinding up and down as it flensed his flesh down to the bone. He had the perfect response to that. Savage Rhythm was already working to speed up each and every blow he struck, so much so that he was actually starting to think he might need to invest points in a mental once the skill ramped up to full. Blood splattered everything, including Velik, but in a matter of moments, he'd put so many holes in the tongue that he was able to tear himself free. Backpedaling, he leveled his spear into the black hole with teeth, trying to drag him into it. Despite the flailing tongue splashing blood everywhere, the monster was still very much alive. I'll fix that. Dread Lance flared down the length of the spear and roared into the monster. The mouth flexed, attempting to pull away from the energy, but Velik hurled the spear forward. It grew twice its length in time it took to travel from his fingers past the teeth. Maybe this was a bad idea, he thought the instant before the skill detonated. He'd never tried it in such a tight space before. The skill exploded outward, disintegrating the monster right in front of his eyes, but also ripping apart the flesh coating the walls and rebounding backward to him. Dreadlance slammed into him, throwing him off his feet, and Velik hit the far wall hard. With a groan, he slid back to the ground at the same time the kill notification popped up. You've slain a flesh-mouth lurker, level 31. Okay, what did we learn? Maybe that just because you have a new toy doesn't mean you need to play with it at every possible opportunity. He climbed back to his feet and reclaimed his spear from the alcove the mouth had been occupying. All of the fleshy covering had been scoured away by Dreadlance, giving him his first look at bare stone since he'd walked into the dungeon. Even as he stepped over the edge, he could see it squirming about as it started to regrow. Whatever blood had seeped out was gone, scoured away by the energy of his skill, and the flesh had sealed itself closed before it could lose more. Velik hesitated to waste a healing potion, but he didn't have time to recover on his own, and having been caught in his own attack, he was hurting. Getting slammed into a wall hadn't been so bad, but his whole face felt like it was cooked and pieces of his shirt had dissolved to reveal bare, bright red skin beneath. He was lucky Torwin had emphasized mending as the enchantment all his clothes needed. After he drank the potion and took a few minutes to recover, he slipped out of the alcove and forced himself the rest of the way through the crevice. The whole way, he eyed every thick vein with suspicion, but none of them opened up and tried to eat him like the first one. Whether that was because there weren't more wall mouths, or because they were smart enough not to try what the first one had failed to do, Velik couldn't be sure. Apex Hunter hadn't so much as twinged until the tongue hit him, but either way, he eventually pulled himself free and was able to walk normally. At least there were no centipedes. It was hardly a comforting thought. He doubted the monsters were gone for good, and there was no reason to believe that he'd conquered the whole dungeon's only inconvenient terrain. Slowly, his spear gripped in his hands, and its tip pointed forward. He started walking again. The walls were different now. Strange pustules hung open from them, somewhat similar to the burst scorpling sacs on the broodmother's back, but all different sizes. They hung in clusters, limp and deflated, with some sort of dried fluid staining the ground beneath them. The walls themselves were darker, or at least some other color. It was hard to tell without his full range of vision, but the veins became more indistinct as everything faded to black. The slithering rasp of a centipede skittering across the walls came to his ears, and Velik spun to face the sound. Ah, there they are. I knew those were going to make another appearance. Much like the scorplings, the monsters that the system called stone-leg centipedes attacked with the strength of numbers and a venomous bite on their side. Unlike the scorplings, however, they were easily able to cling to the walls and ceiling while skittering around at full speed. Velik's limbs were a blur as he lashed out with his spear, slicing through the reinforced hides of the monsters with every blow. Guts and gore splattered to the ground along with long, twitching bodies, hundreds of legs kicking blindly against each other as the bodies twisted up on themselves. He pushed system notifications off to the side of his mind and focused on his work, knowing that if any of the monsters managed to get past him, that the whole assault would become much harder to deal with. He could hold this tunnel with a spear enchanted with shape-shifting and sheer speed. The problem, which quickly became apparent, was that he couldn't stop more monsters from pouring in behind him from other tunnels. Much like the upper portions of the dungeon, everything was an interconnected maze that he hadn't even begun to figure out. It was the sound of them crawling up behind him that gave their game away. Shit, I knew it. All of a sudden, he had to work more than twice as hard, spinning wildly and laying in his centipedes coming from every direction. Hundreds of bodies built up into piles, which actually made things harder since centipedes didn't have any compunction about slithering through a mound of corpses to reach him. Maybe if the dying and dead ones had the decency to lay still, it would have been easier to pick out the movement of the live ones, but that wasn't the case. It didn't really become a problem until the bodies were heaped up so thick that he was dancing atop the still twitching corpses while he fought. He saw the pincers closing around his ankle a fraction of a second before they actually made contact. That was all the time he needed with savage rhythm, enhancing his speed, but even though his spear flashed down and cleanly beheaded the centipede, that didn't stop it from locking onto him. Then there was an unfamiliar weight shackled to one leg, and the pincers were cutting through the leather of his boot into his skin. That was the moment things started to fall apart. A few seconds later, when 6 centipedes came at him at once from different directions, one of the ones on the ceiling got through his defenses. Its entire 8-foot-long body slammed into him, legs scrabbling against his chest and shoulders and coils of its midsection blinding him as it tried to wrap itself around his head. He felt its pincers clamp down on his forearm and tighten. The centipedes were no match for his raw physical strength, however. Even against the constricting body and sharp-tipped feet trying to cut his skin into ribbons, Velik merely pushed back and forced the centipede off him. The danger was never in being crushed, but in the time it took him to get free. Working in a frenzy, he shrugged off the centipede and forced the other ones back. More and more kills piled up, and Savage Rhythm quickly reached its maximum potency. Even that wasn't enough to keep all the monsters back, and the next time they reached him, it was 3 at once. Velik was knocked from his feet into a squirming, writhing pile of living and dead centipedes. I can't believe I'm doing this again, not 5 minutes later. Dreadlance surged down his spear and into the nearest target. Energy expanded outward, destroying the body. Velik wasn't sure that particular monster had been alive before being targeted or not, and catching a few dozen more monsters in its radius. He managed to point his spear mostly in the direction of the tunnel, so the backlash was minimal this time. Minimal didn't mean non-existent, unfortunately, and it felt like a giant had smacked his whole body with an open palm perfectly contoured for maximum contact. He staggered backward a step into the swarm of centipedes behind him. But with the pressure taken off one flank for a few seconds, he was quickly able to reestablish some clearance around his body. How many of these monsters are there? He had no idea how many he'd killed over the last few minutes. Hundreds at minimum. His whole world had become nothing but movement, each strike deadly, and each twitch steering his body past a set of pincers or grasping legs. Twice more, he used Dreadlance to clear some space, though he was almost positive the skill was actually destroying more dead bodies than live monsters. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it was over. The whole tunnel still crawled with movement, of course, but none of it was directed at him. He stood atop a shifting pile of corpses, one of several dozen he'd left as he'd ranged up and down the tunnel to keep from being buried under monster flesh, his chest heaving for breath and his spear heavy in his hands. Mending is the best enchantment ever invented, he thought to himself as he regarded his clothing. He'd be naked without the self-repairing nature of his wardrobe. Not that he'd want to wear such stained and foul-smelling clothes to begin with. Luckily, mending fixed that too. Eventually, he carefully climbed free of the remnants of the slaughter, a tricky task given how long it took the bodies to stop wriggling even after he'd decapitated or eviscerated them. Presumably, the dungeon would reclaim them all eventually, but he wasn't going to stand around and wait for the corpses to dissolve and the way forward to be clear. Once, he thought a living centipede had gotten trapped under the weight of bodies, only to wriggle free and attack him as he was climbing by, but it turned out to just be some sort of nerve response to the corpse being shifted around as he walked on it that caused the pincers to snap closed. He realized that a few seconds after his spear went through its skull when he didn't get a kill notification. It was only after he'd fully cleared the site of the slaughter that he got to looking through his notifications. Most were easily dismissed, just messages of Dekarmos gain and centipedes of up to level 33 slain. 3 stood out though, all of them skill rank increases. He'd pushed Savage Rhythm up to rank 2 early in the fight, which didn't really surprise him. It had been instrumental to his victory, helping him keep up with what would have otherwise been an overwhelming tide of monsters. Spear Warden had also gone up a rank, which he attributed more to it being an inevitable fact of it being such a core skill than due to the specific nature of the previous fight. As long as he kept fighting with a spear, Spear Warden was going to get stronger. The last rank up was to Apex Hunter, surprisingly. At first, he couldn't figure out what it was about the encounter that had caused a skill to rank up, but eventually he decided it was the perception-based skills that had gone into its mix. Velik hadn't had time to consciously process what he was seeing during the fight. There were too many bodies, but somehow he'd kept his spear moving while defending himself from every direction. They were excellent gains, but he wasn't sure he'd want to go through another battle like that again. He'd never had a fight where individual monsters were easily slain, but overwhelming numbers and tight confines conspired against him. Even when fighting packs of wargs, he'd always been able to string them along into a running battle through the woods, if necessary. This type of fighting in a place where he was severely limited in how he could use his weapon was a new type of difficulty for him. Only thing to do about it is finish my business, so I can get the hell out of here, he decided, his face set into a grim mask as he straightened his back and strode purposefully away from the mounds of dead monsters. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Monsters grew powerful in the same way people did, through killing. He knew the truth of this, which was why thousands upon thousands of his creations had died at the hands of each other. Only the strongest deserved the gift of life. Only the strongest were fit to serve as the canvas he worked on. The intruder would make for a marvelous canvas. He'd been tested over and over again, and he still survived. Even against the most powerful champions, he'd found a way to grow in his power. It was like watching a master chef prepare the most decadent meal. His mind twinged at that memory, and he wondered who it had come from. There were too many personas feeding into the amalgamation to narrow it down, usually, but lately one particular mind was coming to the forefront. He knew the intruder, and that familiarity bred purpose and resolve. He wanted to be there to speak to the intruder when he made it to the end of the path. Until then, he had to hold on to his sense of self, to keep from being swept away in the current. The intruder would have to hurry, though, else it would be too late. Then again, did it really matter who was at the forefront? They were all one, in the end. The fleshy coating on the walls wasn't uniform in any way. It had varying texture, smooth in some places and rough in others, and a smattering of scars. There were long, jagged slices that had healed into puckered scars and small circles from where it had been stabbed or punctured all over. Veins as thick as Velik's arm formed massive webs, sometimes standing out in distinct ridges along the walls. One thing he hadn't seen up until this moment was an eye. In fact, even with his mental stat pushing his perception far beyond normal human limits, he wasn't entirely sure that was what he was looking at now. It was nothing more than a small black pinprick in the skin to casual observation, easily mistaken for a speck of dirt on the wall. He would have thought the same if he hadn't caught the flicker of movement as he walked by. Even then, it was only because he was using night vision to navigate that the motion popped out to him. Something about the way it reduced the whole world to black and white outlines made it visible in a way that a full spectrum of colors didn't. He peered at it, finger poised an inch away, and wondered if he was just imagining things. The speck only superficially resembled an eye, and since he'd started paying attention, it hadn't moved at all. As much as he doubted himself, though, he couldn't honestly say he found the idea of the tunnel being laced with eyes that were watching his every move all that surprising. It made sense in a twisted sort of way. The whole dungeon was covered in a layer of flesh. There was no reason it couldn't have other parts of a human as well, and lots of them. It would also explain how the dungeon kept track of the monster hunters who came to destroy it. Not that he was necessarily here for that. He just wanted his compass to start working so he could find Chalin, and so far, he'd seen nothing to prove his childhood friend was here. Except, maybe I did? There was another champion elite, but since I couldn't recover the seed, I don't know if it was Kalen's or not. His only options were to press forward and hope to find answers, or to give up and leave. If he gave up, he might as well keep walking until the frontier was 1,000 miles behind him. After so many years, he needed these answers. He'd do anything for them, take stupid risks against monsters far stronger than he had any right to face, all just to get one step closer to the truth. The way he understood dungeon architecture to work meant there was probably one more champion in front of a core chamber at the very least, possibly multiple champions he might have to fight his way through. Once he reached the core chamber, he'd smash the core and the dungeon would die. Then, presumably, it would stop interfering with his compass. If he found Chalin here, then he'd have reached his goal. If not, he could keep going unhindered and the world was a slightly better place with one less source of monsters. Truthfully, he wasn't sure this dungeon was the only one in the area. It seemed to produce only 2 specific types of monsters, and he'd seen a far greater variety in the deep wood. He explored for another hour or two, slowly building up his mental map of the caves. Occasionally, he found more of those sallow sack-like flaps hanging off the walls, always empty. Sometimes he'd see little spots of fluid that hadn't quite dried, either puddled in the sack itself or on the ground beneath it. What he didn't see was whatever had come out of that sack, but he assumed it was all the centipedes that had tried to bury him under sheer numbers. If this was some sort of breeding ground, it explained why they'd come at him in waves. Some had torn their way free from their sacks faster than others, and some had been closer to where he was fighting. It wasn't until he got deeper that he started seeing something different, sacks that were still full. Velik couldn't tell what exactly was in them. The skin was too thick and leathery, or maybe it was just a quirk of night vision, but they couldn't all be the same monster. Some of the sacks were the size of his head. Others, he could have fit fully inside with room to spare. Every time he found one, he sliced it open with his spear and made sure to kill the half-formed monster inside. Usually, it was some twisted amalgamation of limbs, bones, and organs put together in no discernible pattern. Sometimes, the creature was alive when he cut it free of the sack, forcing him to kill it. The system itself didn't seem to have a good answer to what the monsters were, instead labeling them as malformed fleshlings, level 1. Some sort of fail monster? Or maybe it just wasn't done yet. The idea that he was killing monsters before they could even finish developing didn't bother him at all, and Velik went out of his way to destroy every single sack he could find just in case whatever was inside wasn't dead yet. It slowed him down somewhat, but he reasoned that an extra hour or two now could save him months of hunting in the future. The reality was probably a lot more complicated, but he wasn't interested in that. Things were going well. He destroyed the sacks as he found them, and occasionally, an actual monster would get in his way. There were no more invisible walls that tried to melt his skin off his face if he attacked them, and the centipedes were much easier to defeat than the scorpions had been. The only problem was that, for all his poking around, he still hadn't found what he was actually here for. He came into a chamber that looked like it was full of melting candles, each 4 or 5 feet wide and stretching all the way to the roof of the cavern. The fleshy covering sagged over itself in great, floppy folds, and rather than the monster-sized sacks he'd been seeing before, everything was covered in strands of some snot-like substance. Well, this might be the most disgusting thing I've ever seen. Embedded into the mucus were thousands and thousands of little gray orbs, no bigger around than his thumbnail. They were bunched up into clusters that hung off the pillars, draped over the flesh like strings of pennants. Velik frowned and wished he had a way to throw just a bit of light into the room, just to see what color everything really was. Dreadlance hadn't kept that property of phalanx. Unfortunately, though he supposed if he was willing to detonate one against a pillar, he'd get a brief flicker in the instant the energy spread outwards. A flicker of movement overhead caught his eye. Velik looked up to see a small hole in the ceiling with a monster crawling out of it. It had 4 legs and 2 smaller, delicate arms, and was shaped something like a spider, only with more sharp edges on the joints. There was just one, and Apex Hunter was completely confident that it wasn't a threat. He doubted it was even level 10. The monster skittered across the roof of the cavern according to some indecipherable logic until it reached one of the fleshy pillars. Then it climbed down, unhooked a cluster of the orbs by severing the mucus line connecting it to the rest. Its task finished, it hoisted the orbs onto its back and scaled its way back up to the ceiling, where it disappeared back into the same hole it had emerged from. "What the hell was that?" he said, not even realizing he'd spoken it out loud until after he'd already said it. Cautiously, he reached out with his spear and hooked one of the orb clusters, cutting it free by using shape-shifting to curve the tip of the spear into something that resembled a sickle. It wasn't often he missed identify, but right now he wished the skill hadn't been folded into Apex Predator. It had contributed a strong sense of intuition about monsters, and in a lot of ways identify couldn't, but the trade-off was that it didn't help much for stuff like this. The mucus gluing the orbs together started to stretch and separate as he brought the cluster closer. Despite that, none of the orbs actually fell loose. Is it some sort of food for the monsters? They kind of look like fruit, but I've never seen a vegetarian monster before. He plucked one of the orbs loose from the cluster and squeezed it between his fingers. Immediately, it burst apart and a system notification popped up. "You have slain a seed of corruption, level 1. Velik regarded the goo on his fingers with disdain and flicked it away, then dropped the rest of the cluster onto the ground. Mercilessly, he stomped the seeds until they were nothing but paste. Then he looked around the room with an appraising gaze, mentally calculating how long it would take to destroy them all. I wonder what will show up to try to stop me. He reached out with his spear to bring down another cluster, then stomped it underfoot. The first indication that he wasn't alone was a peculiar plopping sound that Velik had first heard a few days ago in the upper reaches of the flesh caves. His eyes snapped over to the entrance, but of course there was nothing to see. There hadn't been last time either. He'd only been destroying the corruption seeds for about 10 minutes and had barely even started to clear off the first of the fleshy, melted candle-shaped pillars, but he wasn't going to let himself get trapped in here. Dreadlance might work to blast through the wall. He hadn't tried it yet, and he didn't want to until he had to. That meant he needed to get out now before the invisible membrane fully stretched itself across the exit. For some reason, the monsters that made up the wall didn't seem to register to Apex Hunter. Maybe it was the fact that they were neither predator or prey, but something else that existed outside that cycle. Maybe it was just some skill the monster had to help him hide. Velik didn't know, but it was damn annoying either way. He stumbled over an invisible slime, but he'd been expecting that. They always seemed to position themselves in his way, too frequently for him to believe it was anything but on purpose. Whatever senses they had to guide them obviously weren't hindered by the dark and gave them enough lead time to get into position. His shins hit the invisible wall 3 steps later, and he pitched forward into a one-handed handspring. Something struck his leg and knocked him off balance, but Velik was agile enough to compensate and still ended up back on his feet at the end of the tumble. With his spear out in front of him, making wide sweeps, he rushed up the tunnel. Phew, that was close. I was hoping there wouldn't be any more of those things this far down, but I guess that was too much to ask for. I just can't figure out what the point is, though. That definitely could have trapped me in a dozen different places. It's like I'm being herded. That wall was different. It wasn't preventing him from going back. If he'd stood there and let it, it would have sealed him in. That might have been worth it, though. Now that he was out of danger and had a second to think about it, he could have taken his time destroying the rest of the seeds, then blasted his way out with Dreadlance. Then again, he hadn't proven the new skill would work, and experimenting when he didn't have another way out wasn't a great idea. No, this way is better. I'll come back and finish up with those seeds once I break the dungeon core. The truth was that he wasn't sure if he could break a dungeon core. The last champion he'd fought had nearly been too much, might even have overwhelmed him if not for merging 2 skills mid-battle. He hadn't used his haste potion, but that was only because he didn't see more attacks being the solution to that fight. More and more, his problem with punching up in levels had been penetrating the monster's thick hides. If the dungeon was going to throw an even tougher champion elite at him, that might just be the wall that finally stopped him. But he wouldn't know until he got there. And if he let himself be locked up in a room full of creepy parasitic seed monsters, he'd never find out. Was that the plan? Leave me to die in there, then let one of the seeds take over my body? But if so, why not build the wall farther back from the mouth of the tunnel where I might not have noticed it, or at least they would have had more time to get the slime stacked up? Either he was misunderstanding what the dungeon was trying to do, or the dungeon just wasn't that smart. He snorted at the thought. Smart enough to trap your dumbass down here, isn't it? The only other thing he could think was that killing monsters was fine, but destroying the seeds wasn't for some reason. It didn't make sense to him why they'd be any different, but what did he know about how a dungeon worked anyway? Whatever the reason, the rules were different for that room. Velik returned to exploring what he thought of as the lower tunnels of the flesh caves, most of which were anywhere from 3 to 8 feet wide, though he did find a few spots tighter than that. None of those weird wall mouths were lurking there, though. He knew because he thoroughly stabbed the wall ahead of him on both sides each time he had to squeeze through. He also shanked every little eye speck he could find, but he had a suspicion that he missed far more than he found, and that even if he did hunt down all of them, the dungeon could just grow new ones whenever it wanted. Velik, something hissed softly from ahead. He froze, his eyes scouring the darkness. A monster that could talk was a new one, but from what he understood, those corrupted seeds could do it back in town, so there wasn't any reason one of them couldn't do it here. On the other hand, one that could talk and knew his name was a bit creepier. Velik, the voice called out again, so soft that he could barely hear it. Okay, so this is obviously a trap, but do I have any other choice? The dungeon can block off the way back whenever it wants. It only needs a minute, so it doesn't need voices in the dark to bait me into position. It knows my name? Somehow. And I'm here because of Chalin. Connection? There was only one way to find out. Who's there? He called out, his voice echoing weirdly in the flesh-coated tunnel. We've been looking for you, the voice said back. Come to us. The way is open. What way? Who is we? And why can't you come to me? But the voice was silent. It had said everything it meant to, apparently. It was up to Velik whether or not to walk forward. You're being an idiot. The smart thing to do here is focus on getting out. Get somebody like Torwin to come back with you. Or even better, a whole dungeon clearing team. You're in over your head. Use Dreadlance to break the slime walls and leave. Another part of him argued, it's been 10 years of fighting, of looking for answers, of being alone. Don't you want it to be over with? Aren't you tired of wondering what happened? And he was. He'd come here for answers, and now they were within reach. He wasn't going to let a fear of the unknown Stop him now. Squaring his shoulders, spear in hand, Velik followed the voice into the darkness. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. At first, he thought it was another scar in the wall, twisted and puckered like all the rest. It was only when it split open to reveal crooked, brown teeth that Velik realized it was a mouth, fully a foot wide. Yes, approach. We are waiting, it said as he got close. Another mouth opened farther down the tunnel, right in front of his eyes. One moment, the wall was a bare patch of flesh. The next, it was swelling into a pair of cracked, dirty lips that parted to reveal a black tongue. This way, it called out. Are you Chalin? He asked. He'd asked the same question 4 times already. The mouths hadn't answered before, and they didn't this time either. I swear to Morgus, I'm going to stab this monster so fucking hard when I finally get to the part with the brain, just for being so cryptic and annoying. The tunnel opened up into the kind of giant cavern he'd found the last champion in, only this time there was obviously something already there. It grew out of the wall, a collection of mismatched parts. Eyes opened and closed all across the wall, some of them pinpricks, others bigger than his head. One in the center was more than 4 feet wide. Noses grew between them, all shapes and sizes, and mouths floated around the outside of the iron nose cluster. Long arms descended from the ceiling in front of it, dozens of them. Most of them had 4 or 5 joints that let them bend at strange angles. All were long enough to reach the floor with room to spare. They worked in 2s and 3s, massaging piles of quivering, living flesh that Velik vaguely recognized as being animals. Is that thing making monsters? Is this how dungeons do it? I thought they formed them whole from mana, not whatever this is. What about those sacks with the incubating monsters in them? You're finally here, the thing in the wall said, its voice coming from a dozen mouths in unison. New eyes opened across the ceiling and the walls around him, all of them locked on Velik. They peered at him from every direction while he stood uneasily at the mouth of the tunnel. For all his earlier bravado, he was starting to think he had indeed made a mistake in coming here. None of this was what he'd expected to find. Who are you? Velik demanded, trying to appear confident as he strode forward. He stopped well short of the reach of those arms and glared at the wall of eyes. Flesh bubbled and faces started popping out, filling the empty space between eyes and noses. They were distorted, hideous caricatures of human beings, made all the worse by the thin, ropish strands of flesh dangling from their scalps where hair should have been. Despite that, so many of them were recognizable to him. Don't you remember us? We remember you, the mouth said as one. When he'd been a child, Velik had learned some basic woodcraft from a transient woodsman who'd come through the frontier. His parents had quickly and loudly objected to their son spending time with a vagabond, no matter how good-natured the man was. Velik had never seen him again. The cobbler's wife had been a favorite of all the children in D-Shur for years. Though she wasn't a class chef, she'd been an avid baker and more than generous with the fruits of her labors. Velik had heard she'd been killed in an attack on the town 5 or 6 years ago, long after he'd been exiled. Both their faces were in the cluster on the wall, along with a dozen others. All of them were distorted, like melted wax bust covered in a layer of skin, but he recognized those too. The rest might be locals, or just unfortunate travelers, or people from some other place he'd never heard of, for all he knew. All of them except one. Chalin was in the center, still the 7-year-old boy from Velik's memories. His voice was lost in the noise, or perhaps so twisted that Velik couldn't recognize it. When the wall spoke, some of the words were clear, spoken in unison by all the faces, but most of the noise was just that. Noise. It was like a dozen people talking to him at once, and only occasionally saying the same thing. Velik, they said in unison. The Black Fang. You have returned to us. Then the voices fell apart again, each one saying something different. He wanted to hear everything they were saying, needed to know the truth. Focusing on it was difficult. Every time he thought he was following a particular voice, another one would overlap it and draw his attention away. By the time he realized he'd lost the thread, it was too late to get it back. He caught bits and pieces, some of it seemingly nonsense, but also scraps about a reforged Link, crooning about how strong he was to defeat their champions, and, most alarmingly, promises to transform him into a bastion of power. That particular comment, coming from a wizened old face near the top of the wall, and combined with the arms still actively kneading mounds of flesh like bread dough, disturbed Velik so much that he took a step back and brought his spear up. "Do not resist," the faces said together. This is how it was meant to be. More arms grew out of the ceiling and reached for him. For just a second, Velik stared at them dumbly. Then something started burning against his chest, and he snapped out of it. The amulet! Torwin was right. This thing is trying to get into my head. It was a good thing the old monster hunter had insisted that Velik needed something to defend his mind. Otherwise, he might never have noticed the arms descending from the ceiling above him. But he did have the amulet, and while it didn't grant immunity to the hypnotic lull of the voices, it helped enough that he wasn't caught totally unaware. Just before a hand big enough to wrap all the way around his skull touched him, he burst into motion. His spear came up between him and the hand as he backpedaled, slashing through tough, rubbery flesh and sending droplets of thick black blood through the air. Faces started screaming, seemingly at random, but Velik pushed the sound aside. It was already hard enough to focus without adding another layer of distractions. "Stop!" The voices all screeched at him as he fended off another hand. The sound of so many voices shouting in unison sent spikes of pain into his mind, causing him to gasp and his vision to go blurry. Velik fought through it, but before he'd realized what was happening, a hand had caught him around one arm and pulled him forward. Apex Hunter started sounding the alarms in his head, the skill warning him that he was in as much danger as he'd ever been in. Even being inside the mouth of the great wolf hadn't triggered a reaction this potent and, on the surface of things, that had seemed far more imminently fatal. Then again, the worst that could be said there was that Velik would have died. Here, his fate was far more uncertain. One thing he knew for sure was that he didn't want to be one of those piles of quivering flesh being worked over. Sickening as it was, he was almost certain they were all somehow still alive. So when the giant hand dragged him forward into the waiting grasp of the monster, Velik did the only reasonable thing he could think of. He went absolutely berserk, trying to escape. His spear swept out, savage rhythm, already starting to work on it, and stabbed into the many joints of the arm connected to the hand holding him. At the same time, his other hand drew his belt knife and slashed it across the fingers clamped onto his bicep. He didn't care if he dug too deep and cut his own flesh, just so long as the hand let go of him. More hands descended on him, but Velik was free now, and he completely put the voices out of his mind. The next few seconds were a blur, and when it was over, even he wasn't entirely sure what had happened, but he'd made it out of the range of the monster's reach. Black blood speckled the floor and his clothes, and the blade of his spear was completely coated with it, but he was free. "You are ours. Return to us." The monster bellowed from multiple throats and raged at his resistance. Or maybe they're not talking to me, he realized as he heard the sound of scrabbling in the darkness. It was no surprise to see monsters slithering into the cavern from various holes hidden in the fleshy folds that shrouded the stone. "Bring us the champion. Let his form be remade into one more suitable for his status." The centipedes were the first to reach him, but Velik knew how to fight those. These ones were no different than the hundreds he'd already killed, and he had a measure of the wall monster's range now. Its hands were fast and creepily flexible on those multi-jointed arms, but as long as Velik kept himself near the entrance, he was safe. That was a dangerous thought. He'd seen new hands grow out of the ceiling, quickly descending on stalks of flesh, and so he wasn't terribly surprised when more of them came down from directly overhead. Unfortunately, he was too busy to guard against them, not when he was busy fending off 4 different giant centipedes at the same time. Velik spun in place, his spear flashing through the air to drive a centipede back while he hopped over a set of pincers aimed at his calf. A hand enveloped his face and clenched around his skull, pulling him off his feet. He was 8 feet in the air before he could grab hold of the wrist, only to find its strength was so immense that even his triple-digit physical stat wasn't enough to free him. He was considerably more leery about cutting through fingers grabbing onto his skull than his arm, especially when the palm of the hand was blinding him, but he didn't see much other choice. The arm was at least 6 inches thick, maybe more, and his spear wasn't the right kind of weapon to free him. Worse, he had multiple monsters scrabbling around below him, and could easily imagine them rearing up to snap pincers around his limbs. No other choice. Hope I'm not about to ruin my dashing good looks. Taking the spear in both hands and activating shape-shifting, he shrunk it down to something that was only 3 feet long with a wide, flat leaf blade. Then he jabbed it straight up into the heel of the palm pressed against his face, praying he had the blind accuracy to avoid slicing off his own nose. The spear punctured the fleshy hand, parting a layer of flesh from meat, and he felt something scrape the tip of his nose as the monstrous hand tried to flex away from the weapon without releasing its hold on Velik. Unwilling to relinquish the advantage, he heaved upwards again. The blade twisted sideways this time, slicing a line across his scalp, but he could tell from the sudden slackness in the hand's grip that he'd severed at least one finger. Jerking the spear back and forth, he quickly loosened the hand enough that he was able to drop free. The spear came with him, sliding loose and showering him with blood and chunks of meat. Velik dropped 6 feet directly onto the back of one of the centipede monsters. It bucked wildly, trying to coil around on itself to get at him, and he nearly tumbled to the ground as he failed to keep his balance. At the last second, he caught himself and drove his spear down into a different monster that was coming around at him, pincers spread wide. This isn't working. Too many attacks from every angle. His hand snaked into his belt pouch and pulled out his fallback option, the haste potion. Without a second's hesitation, he ripped out the cork with his teeth and downed the liquid in a single pull. Instantly, the world seemed to slow down, so much so that he could leisurely examine the no less than 4 giant hands coming down to grab him and the 3 open sets of pincers poised to slice his legs open to the bone. Much better, he thought as he watched the enemy's ponderous movements for what felt like a full minute. Then he stretched his spear back out to full length and reshaped the head into something good for hacking through monster flesh. Plenty of time to clean this mess up. The centipedes practically stood still while he killed them, offering no appreciable resistance to his spear strikes. The moment they were dead, he was in the air, rising on a powerful jump and spear in both hands to swing the bladed edge through an arm like a lumberjack felling a sapling. It wasn't what the weapon was designed for, but shape-shifting helped, and he had strength to spare. He'd already severed 3 arms when the pain scream started. Even in his hasted state, he could hear them reverberating weirdly through the cavern, but they didn't hit as hard mentally. Something about the potion was increasing his perception to match his new speed. A good thing, since otherwise he'd be unable to control his own body, and that change to his brain was making it a lot easier to pick apart the weird mental connection a monster had forged. The potion didn't last long, and he wanted the room cleared of anything remotely resembling a threat before it wore off. That meant killing not only the monsters directly below him, but also taking care of the ones streaming in through the openings made by the retracted flesh walls. It probably wasn't possible to kill everything simply because he expected monsters to keep coming in long after the potion wore off. But if he could give himself a big enough window of uninterrupted time to deal with the wall of faces, he'd consider it a win. He came down on the centipedes like a hammer, slamming both feet into one of them and driving into the ground. At the same time, his spear took another centipede through the head, darting in so fast that it was like hitting a stationary target. The monster didn't even react to the spear coming its way, just let it split its face in 2. Savage rhythm started up again. More speed pushed through Velik's limbs, so much that he could feel his muscles straining to keep up with his mind. Is the potion having a bad reaction to the skill? It didn't matter. He could fight through it. He had to. The only other option was to let himself be captured, and that was no choice at all. Velik killed the centipedes in a blur of motion, all of them collapsing in a heap of blood, broken chitin, and dismembered limbs. Savage rhythm continued to build up, and he turned his spear on the closest of the grasping hands, cutting them loose to litter the ground. More monsters came flooding into the cavern, but in painfully slow motion. Velik cut his way through them, too fast for them to react, and cleared a dozen out of the closest opening before retreating back into the main cavern and repeating the process on the next hole. In a matter of 5 seconds, he completed a full circuit around the room. He still had 20 seconds of hasted movement left, some of which would be spent clearing out the hands, chasing him around the room. They didn't seem like much of a threat at the moment, both because the arms were starting to get tangled up around each other, and because they were so slow that there was no chance of them catching him. But he could see the nubs where more arms were starting to grow out of the ceiling. More worrying were the nubs coming out of the walls and floors. It won't matter how fast I am if there's nowhere to go. I need to do something about this, but I don't know what. There had to be tens of thousands of pounds of flesh the monster could use as raw material to shape new limbs lining the various caves and tunnels. For all he knew, its reach stretched all the way to the surface. Nothing he'd done seemed to actually slow the monster down, and he wasn't even sure he'd actually heard it. The screams could just as easily be anger as pain. With the sound distortion from his haste potion making it hard to understand the noise, he honestly wasn't sure what he was hearing. There was a weak spot somewhere. Maybe it was the faces, or maybe it was hidden away, but Velik would find it. He knew where he was going to start, though. With nothing left to distract him from a monster that Apex Hunter wanted him to tear into, Velik burst forward. His spear hacked through limbs, its shaft given more flexibility by shape-shifting, and the blade thickened and sharpened on one side to give it a strong cutting edge. The screaming intensified, every face joining in now. If Velik thought it had been loud before, he was just now realizing how little he'd understood the capacity for sound the wall of faces possessed. The whole cave was rippling, flesh jiggling around like an energetic fat man dancing for a lively audience. Even with his potion-enhanced speed, it was a challenge to keep his footing. There were 6 faces he recognized across the wall, and another 10 he didn't. Several new ones had grown out of the skin, filling in gaps between the noses and mouths while he'd been distracted by the other monsters. Velik didn't think about it too much. He just chose the most convenient one that wasn't familiar to him. He kicked off the ground in a flying leap, spear leading the way, and slammed it into the face hard enough that he was sure the blade would strike stone behind it. It sunk 4 feet into the wall, but if there was rock behind the facade, he couldn't reach it. That didn't stop him from ripping the spear free and stabbing it into another face. He was about to destroy a third one when something hit him. It expanded out of the wall in front of him, a hand size to wrap around his entire body and already curled into a fist, and sent him flying even as his spear sliced a gash across its knuckles. Velik spun twice in the air, his spine and hips working to reorient him, and he landed on his feet with his weapon still in hand. 12 seconds left. 2 of those were wasted cutting away new growths of hands reaching for him. A few came up directly from the ground, nothing but hands with no arms attached to them that grew so quickly they almost grabbed onto his ankles before he could get away. Once again, Velik grew concerned that he was going to be in trouble once the haste potion wore off. The huge fist sunk back into the wall, sending a ripple through it that reminded him of a rock dropped into water, only without the splash. In its place, 2 faces grew back again. One was the one Velik had been targeting when he'd been hit, but the other was a face he'd already destroyed. They're not a weakness, then. This thing is some sort of flesh shaper. I need to find its vital organs, but they could be anywhere. Screw this. I'll never hit anything important if it can move everything around, not unless I do it all at once. Dreadlance arced down the length of his spear, primed and ready for him to discharge the skill as soon as he made contact. However, the monster perceived the world around it. It was able to process things fast enough to react to Velik's enhanced speed, and it knew better than to give him a clean shot. It must have cost the monster something extra to do it, but it was capable of growing new limbs fast enough to interfere with Velik. Arms shot out of the floor so fast, it was almost as if they materialized fully formed instead of grew. But it wasn't enough. 7 seconds left. He slipped by them, his spear held overhead with its deadly payload waiting for him to reach his target. The arms lashed out, hands grasping at him, but they were too slow. More grew out of the ground, and when he swept past them too quickly for them to do anything, another massive fist jutted out of the wall itself. This time Velik was ready for it. He jumped straight up, pulling his legs up to clear the limb, then slammed his feet down on the back of it. It smacked into the ground, but it wasn't designed to have that range of motion. Rather than bending at a non-existent wrist, the wall itself tore open. It was the perfect target, and without hesitation, Velik slammed the spear into the wound. Every time he'd used Dreadlance, he'd been hit with a backlash. The skill was wild, uncontrolled, and even with a weapon as long as a spear, it seemed it was impossible to avoid being caught in the edges of the blast. But perhaps he just hadn't been doing it right. This time, the energy flooded the wall, which immediately ruptured. Chunks of meat and buckets of blood went flying in every direction, plastering Velik with ichor as the flesh exploded. The debris flew at high speeds, and it had mass, but without any chitin, teeth, or bone in it. It wasn't nearly as deadly as the last time he'd been hit with shrapnel. The fist he was balanced on sagged down, fully severed from the wall by its own weight. Velik was about to retreat, the last few seconds of his haste potion best used to assess the damage and decide on his next move, when he noticed something behind the wall. It was another chamber, one hidden by a full 10 feet of muscle and viscera, exposed only because of the sheer destructive force of Dreadlance. The chamber looked like something choked with cobwebs, except the webs were made of sinews and nerves and long, stringy ropes of arteries and veins. And in the center, suspended by it all, was a wrinkled mass of red flesh that looked suspiciously like an oversized brain. Maybe someone like Torwin would have known what was going on. The man had decades of experience, and he seemed pretty smart, so he'd probably seen all sorts of weird stuff throughout his career. No doubt he'd have 3 different stories about giant brain monsters and what that meant. Velik was a simple man. He knew that monsters, like people, generally needed brains to survive. There were probably 100 exceptions where the monsters were made entirely of dirt or were undead or whatever, but as a general rule of thumb, he'd had good luck with the strategy of locating and destroying brains when he wanted to kill something. There was no reason to change that strategy now. The monster, whatever it was, and Velik was trying hard not to think about that thing that had Kalen's face in it, apparently also felt the brain was important because it wasn't content to let him just rush forward and stab it. Its flesh shaping took on a whole new level. No longer willing to mold its shape into grasping hands or a forest of arms, it instead projected ridged and spiked bones out of its body. They were sharpened like spears, and hundreds of them rose out of the ground and descended from the ceiling. No, not bone. Teeth, he quickly realized. They lacked the muscles to bite and chew, but they were still teeth. Each one was 6 feet long, 4 inches at the base, and tapering to a needlepoint for the last foot or so. They spiked out of the flesh seemingly at random, but always aimed to impale Velik. He'd thought the monster had been aggressive in its attempts to catch and restrain him before, but this was a whole different level. If he'd had a few more seconds on the haste potion, he might have made it to the brain in time. Instead, a new wall of flesh rose up between him and his target while the teeth fended him off. Time sped back up in his perceptions. The monster's movements no longer slow and predictable. Everything snapped back to normal, and suddenly he realized how sore his body was, how much savage rhythm had pushed him beyond his limits while under the hasting effect, that caused him to stumble so bad that he was almost impaled on a growing tooth. Only by slapping his hand onto the side of it and earning himself a slice across his palm in the process was he able to shift himself out of the way in time. Velik ignored the stinging pain and tried not to think about how sharp the teeth were to cut through his skin just from brief contact. He got past the line of teeth a moment later, but it was too late. The flesh membrane growing as a barrier in front of him was rapidly darkening as it got thicker, and if it was anything like those clear walls in the cave, he'd need a Dreadlance to get through it. That wasn't going to happen in the next minute or so, maybe longer at the pace he was pushing himself. The skill was incredibly draining to use, something he hoped would be alleviated by ranking it up a few times. Fortunately, it was the only one that really pulled heavily on his mystic stat. Apex Hunter got a bit fuzzier when he used Dreadlance, but not to the point where it wasn't functional anymore. That meant that pretty much all his reserves could be used for offensive purposes, but he still needed to pace himself between shots. He was still getting used to having a skill that used so much power, and Mystic wasn't something he'd really specialized in. Just because he was sure the wall was as unbreakable as all the others didn't mean he wasn't going to try. If he was lucky, he'd reach it before it finished solidifying and could cut through. More teeth were already jutting out of the flesh-covered floor, and the spots under his feet were pulling back, trying to trip him up and cost him his balance. Velik was too quick and too coordinated to be stopped by either tactic, but if the goal was just to delay him until it was too late, he had to admit the monster was doing an excellent job of it. It just wasn't enough to stop him. He jumped another set of needle-like teeth and drove the spear into the rapidly thickening wall. Even before he landed, he was adjusting his feet to prepare for the deflection when he failed to cut through, so he was quite surprised to find that the flesh parted just as easily as the rest. The spear punched clean through the wall, then split open a loose flap for Velik to peer through. He got a brief glimpse of the brain, now being encased in what was probably bone that had grown down from the ceiling. The brain itself was higher in the air, perhaps tugged up on those sinewy ropes that tethered it to everything else, and more muscle was building up beneath it, thickening around a quasi-skeleton that Velik was sure didn't have half the bones needed for unaided movement. Then the wall stitched itself back up, the tear in it closing as new flesh grew out from the edges. Velik stabbed another hole in it, but not before more teeth lanced up at him from between his feet. Eager to dodge that particularly painful injury, he quick-stepped to the side. What the hell is that thing doing in there? Is it just growing more defenses? But if so, why weren't they already in place? He'd never fought a monster like this before, but he was starting to get worried. If he was right, the layer of flesh covering the entire cave complex was all part of this one organism. It was no wonder the mana compass had gone crazy while he was inside, and that Min had literally tons and tons of mass to manipulate. There was no way he'd ever kill the monster just by stabbing at it. He needed to target something important, and that meant getting to that brain before the monster finished doing whatever it was trying to do. Morgus, please tell me if I'm making a mistake here. Don't let the brain be a decoy or something. Don't let the monster be that smart. Gods, what are the odds this thing isn't at least as smart as me? It can talk and control other monsters. Is this thing even a champion elite? I never got a notification about its domain. Velik shook off the questions. What he needed now was to focus on figuring out how to kill it. Everything else could wait for later and hopefully be answered by someone much smarter than him. He stabbed through the wall again, this time reshaping the tip of his spear into something with a thicker blade in the hopes that it wouldn't repair itself so fast. He needed to cut his way through, and that wasn't going to be easy if it kept closing up as fast as he could damage it. 15 seconds later, not only had he failed to make any progress, but the cave itself was getting better about hindering him. That was more the result of there just being basically nowhere left that was safe to stand than anything, but what mattered was that he was starting to struggle to even stay near the wall, let alone damage it. He could have used more time to recover, but he didn't feel like he had it anymore. With no other option, he sent another dread lance through his spear. Energy crackled across the blade, exploding outwards in all directions and turning flesh, muscle, bones, and blood into a fine mist that appeared as black flecks to his night vision. When a mist cleared enough for him to see past it, he started mentally cursing. The brain was no longer visible. In its place was a thing. It looked something like if a human and a spider were merged together, or maybe it was more like a human and a scorpion, all things considered. It had a torso 10 feet long with 8 arms growing out of it, but maybe they were actually legs. No, he decided, limbs that end in hands or arms, even if it's walking on them. The monster's head was nothing but a stretched mouth wide enough to fit Velik inside it, if just barely, and it hung open, revealing the same needle teeth he'd been dodging around for the last minute, just on a smaller scale. That wasn't to say it didn't have eyes. If anything, it had far too many, but they weren't in any particular spot on its body. Eyelids blinked open and closed all over, on its chest, and its scalp, on its arms, and on the weird, almost wing-like appendages growing out of its back. They weren't really wings, not precisely. It was more like 2 massive hands that had regular-sized palms but 8-foot-long fingers, and twice as many as it should at that. Stretched between them were heavy, drooping strands of skin that almost looked like webbing if it had been woven out of human remains. The monster was still connected through the cave in multiple places. Long, thin lines of what Velik assumed were nerves strung themselves between the monster's back and the roof of the cave. More of them were connected to its belly. He wasn't sure how it planned to move without tangling itself up, but then again, that wasn't his problem. He'd be happy to cut those connections anyway. Maybe then, the creature would die. Or even better, maybe all the flesh coating the walls would die instead. That would be nice to score a quick win against so much monster mass. He doubted he'd get that lucky, though, especially when the creature took a step forward and tore a few dozen of the connections apart. If that hurt it in any way, Velik couldn't tell. Its mouth dropped open, stretching far wider than should have been possible, and with a lurch, the monster bounded directly at him. It wasn't until the monster started moving that Velik truly appreciated how much bigger than him it was. It had to weigh a few thousand pounds, and its weird arm-leg hybrid things were each long enough that the trunk of its body was at eye level. Its movement was awkward to watch, like it couldn't quite figure out how to control its body, but that didn't stop it. Velik didn't stand still and wait for it to run him over, of course. He couldn't have stood his ground even if he'd wanted to, not with the whole cave itself still growing arms and teeth. He was constantly on the move, trying to keep ahead of the monster. It was a losing game, though. No matter how fast he was quickly running out of space. Eventually, there'd be nowhere left that was safe, and he couldn't cut the arms off on the ground fast enough to make more room. Thankfully, one of his predictions was coming to pass. The monster had grown so many limbs that they were getting tangled up after all. It just wasn't as effective as he'd been hoping. While it slowed the pursuit down, it turned out the limbs were just as capable of merging with each other as they were of growing directly out of the mass of living flesh he was standing on. The only good part of this latest development was that the arms were also hindering the mobile monster the cave had spawned. At least, Velik thought they were. Honestly, even with his mental stat over 50, it was hard to tell whether the monster was breaking the arms as it plowed through them or if it was just absorbing them into its body. It certainly seemed to be growing bigger, but Velik couldn't say for certain what exactly the root cause of that was. I need to get out of this cave. It's too crowded in here to properly fight, but there are more monsters to contend with out in the tunnels, and there's no guarantee arms and teeth won't start growing through there as well. Looking back on it, he should have expected something like this. It was a cave entirely lined in a continuous living organism. Of course, the whole thing was a monster. It had him surrounded on all sides, and that wasn't even taking into consideration the regular monsters living inside it. Is that brain in this thing in front of me? Why would it do that? The smart move would be to hide the brain somewhere else and distract me with this. The only way to find out was to destroy the monster and see what happened. That was easier said than done, and not just because he was going to need some time before he was ready to unleash another Dreadlance. The monster was aggressively pursuing him, and after a few seconds, he was absolutely certain that it was getting bigger. His spear lashed out, whistling through the air as it plunged into the monster's head. Flesh parted easily against his strength, mostly because it turned out there was no skull beneath the skin. In fact, there was nothing at all, nothing except more meat. It was like some sort of filler material, there just to hold the head into shape. Velik had a sudden suspicion that the whole monster was that way. The intelligence of whatever it was that designed this thing seemed to understand how to shape flesh to make monsters look real, but there was probably a reason it was growing everything from sacs adhered to its flesh. It could make something, even keep it alive, but its monsters were extensions of itself, not true independent creations. That wasn't right. He wasn't sure how he knew, but he did. Maybe this monster had just been put together too quickly to exist on its own, or maybe the cave had done it on purpose. Either way, it was obviously a decoy meant to make him think the brain was inside it. For all he knew, the brain was a decoy too. This whole thing could be a waste of time. Even if its vulnerable points were here, it could have shifted them far away by now. How do I fight this thing? Getting rid of the monster, chasing him around, was a start. Velik was keeping ahead of it, but just barely. Its wings were unexpectedly adroit, too, easily able to reach all the way around its body. Every time he tried to stab anything other than that decoy ball of meat pretending to be its head, they got in the way. If he couldn't go around them, he'd just have to attack them directly. The next time Velik jabbed at the monster, he was ready for the fingers to whip down and try to grab the spear. Instead of pulling it back, he ripped it straight up and hacked into the finger. There was a moment's resistance, then the digit was flopping free. It still clung to the other ones by the stringy lengths of flesh, but now it hung loose instead of moving around. One down, too many to go. The next 20 seconds were more of the same, with the monster struggling to adapt to his new strategy and Velik steadily cutting more pieces off it. It wasn't an easy strategy to execute, though being able to use shape-shifting to reform the head into something closer to a sword blade helped. The arm legs were harder to cut through, but he managed to sever 2 of them on the same side after he finished demolishing one of the wings. Suddenly, something clamped down on his knee. Cursing, he looked down and saw a squat, 3-fingered hand clutching him tight enough that the enchanted fabric of his pants had torn from its nails. Velik swept his spear down, shortening the shaft as he moved to get the blade lined up properly. He severed the hand at the wrist in a single stroke, which did nothing to remove the fingers digging into his skin, but freed him to move again. He just wasn't fast enough. The big monster slammed into him, its meatball skull striking his chest in a headbutt that picked him up off his feet and threw him 40 feet to slam into the far wall. Immediately, new hands grabbed hold of him, wrapping around his arms and legs. Arms looped over his chest, effectively pinning him hanging 3 feet off the floor. The monster approached, its great, lumbering gait no longer seeming awkward. Over the last minute, it had begun to master how to move its new body with frightening speed. Velik couldn't help but consider how badly he'd misjudged the situation, thinking the monster was something slapped together, some fake puppet creature. No, it was just a newborn. Like anything else, it had to learn how to control its own body. Would have been nice if it could have taken it a few more minutes, though. The skin on its flesh roiled and bubbled, rippling outward and tearing as something emerged. In seconds, there was a face peering at him. It rose up to be level with his, and he found himself staring at the still 7-year-old Chalin. "Why did you leave me?" the boy asked, his voice distorted but still recognizable. "I didn't leave you," Velik found himself saying, though he hadn't had any intention of engaging the monster. "I woke up and you were gone. I was right next to you. You ran." "No, there was a monster there. I didn't recognize it. How was I supposed to know it was you? Why do you look like this now?" "The dungeon core." Chalin trailed off. "You were supposed to be the guardian, but the bond didn't form. You rejected it and you ran." "I don't know what you're talking about," Velik said. He still held his spear in his hand, and he might even be able to stab Chalin with it, but he wasn't sure there was a point. It was obvious that nothing he'd done had actually hurt the cave monster. "I am the dungeon. You are the guardian. I had to make a new one." Chalin paused, and his face twisted in anger. "And then you killed that. You shall take its place." A dozen or more voices howled in unison, their faces emerging all over the cave now that Velik was restrained. "We shall make you into the ultimate weapon to defend ourselves with." His mind raced as he tried to put things together. Chalin had turned into a dungeon core, but one that could somehow move. He was making monsters, and somehow growing bigger and bigger. The situation seemed hopeless, but if there was a core, there was a weakness. He just needed to break free from this fight and find it. The brain looked nothing like the pillar core from the old dungeon, but then again, such an unusual dungeon could have a unique core. It didn't matter, though. The brain was gone. Even if it was the core, it wasn't here in this room. But where? Come on, think. What's different? What's a clue? He was starting to think Dreadlance was causing a problem using so much of his magic. Maybe he was underestimating how much Apex Hunter relied on Mystic to feed him the information he'd been taking for granted. This whole fight, he'd been flailing around blindly, reacting to threats right in front of him and failing to find a way to win. He'd thought it was just because everything was so far outside his experiences, but maybe it was that he wasn't giving his skills the resources they needed. On the other hand, he had a giant monster a foot from his face, and he was being restrained by probably 20 or more hands growing out a wall of flesh. That was a pretty good argument to use his most destructive skill while he still had the chance. If only Mana Drinker would feed into him instead of his spear, the whole thing would be a non-issue. Flexing his arm, he ripped free of the hands gripping him and drove the spear into the monster. Dread Lance sparked, and it blew up in a shower of gore. The backlash washed over him, searing his skin, but also charring the hands holding him. He broke free with a grunt of effort and dropped to the floor, a healing potion already coming free from his hip pouch to counter the damage. "All right," he told the faces as he stood back up. "I think it's time to finish this." Something had occurred to Velik in the last few seconds, something that he wasn't sure he was right about. But if he was, it was very, very important. Even with a full cavern to spread out through, and with literal miles and miles of flesh that composed its body, for some reason, all the faces and mouths were concentrated here. They hadn't even spread out to take up positions on different walls or the ceiling. It was possible that was a meaningless choice, that the faces could appear anywhere and had just chosen not to, but Velik didn't think so. Otherwise, they could have appeared elsewhere in the cave network he'd been exploring for days now. All those arms and hands and teeth and whatever else were sprouting like weeds followed a pattern as well. He just hadn't noticed it until he'd been forced to hold still for a moment and actually taken some time to think about it. Nothing like that had ever happened anywhere else. No arms had sprung out of the walls to bar his passage in the upper tunnels. No, the cave had been forced to use some sort of solidifying slime monster to trap him inside and force him deeper. It might have 1,000 tons of mass to draw on, and it might be able to shape all of that to its will, but distance was a factor. The farther from its core the flesh got, the less it was able to manifest control over it. The Challen monster didn't fit into his hypothesis. It was completely disconnected from the rest of the cavern, but at the same time, it had so many limbs that it was always touching the ground somewhere. Maybe that was enough, or maybe the Challen portion of the collective of minds had separated itself completely in order to control the monster. Can they do that? Could there be 10 or 11 more fully autonomous bodies being built behind other walls right now? If there are, and I kill them all, then what happens to the core itself? If I find and destroy the core, what happens to the minds trapped in this body? Could I have saved Challen and the rest? He wasn't sure if he could take the handicap of hunting the core without fighting back against the monster in front of him to the best of his abilities, but he figured he had one good shot to try. If his theory about proximity to the core was correct, and he assumed that, unlike a standard dungeon core, this one was mobile, that meant all he needed to do was figure out where things were growing fastest and strike there. Oh, and survive long enough to do that. I'm not even sure I've got enough left in me to use Dreadlance again, but I'm going to destroy the core. Shit, that means I've got to stay ahead of this whole nightmare scenario for at least another minute or two. The Challen monster was gone, more or less. The back few arm legs were whole, though charred black, just like the wall Velik had been pinned to, but the rest of the flesh had broken down or been hurled away from the kinetic energy of the skill. All of the severed limbs that had been nearby were similarly gone, either disintegrated or just blown away to get tangled in the growths farther back from the point of the explosion. His best guess was that the brain was moving through the mass of flesh overhead. That was why the longest arms came down from the ceiling and why the attack had started from there. It wasn't until the brain had moved behind that wall that things had started really growing out of the floor, and that had slowed down again once he'd blown open that hiding place. The core could obviously move, but it was giving its position away now that he'd figured out what to look for. The faces were all yelling at him again, but this time it was a lot harder to shrug off the voices. Really, only the fact that they were all screaming different things was what kept him from being overwhelmed. It was easier to ignore the noise when he couldn't figure out what they were saying, but it did clue him into a problem. The amulet Torwin had given him was no longer hanging from his neck. It might not even be in one piece, given that he'd taken a good deal of damage from his Dreadlance, but at the very least, the cord it was hanging on had snapped. Velik didn't have time to go searching for it, though. He'd just have to resist whatever mental connection the dungeon core was trying to form with him. He didn't want to think about what would happen if he couldn't. New arms were growing out of the wall, slowly at first, but speeding up as the core shifted position. It was closing in on him, or at least getting him in range. Now that he knew to look for it, he was amazed he hadn't noticed the lines of growth before. Then again, the floor hadn't been quite so thoroughly covered, and he'd been all over the cavern, leading to the arms growing in a trail that chased him around and tried to predict what direction he'd move in. Now that everything had already popped out of the flesh layer covering the cavern, all that was left was to make it grow faster as needed, and he didn't need Apex Hunter to see that. Velik eyeballed where he thought the core was based on which arms were biggest, then started circling around to it. He didn't know how smart a dungeon core was, but this one was an anomaly anyway, and this would work better if it didn't realize what he was doing. As he'd expected, it kept shifting positions, trying to maintain the same distance, but Velik thought that if he really tried, he could close in on it before it could react. He just needed more time, and the way he planned on gaining that was by letting loose with savage rhythm. His spear arced around him, slicing through anything and everything that he passed in a continuous blur of movement. Full arms were hacked off at the joints and sent flying away, where they were sometimes caught by hands perched atop other arms and replanted into the floor. All of it was a feint, just a way to buy time. It was working, too, until flaps of skin unfolded in the walls and let new monsters into the cavern. There are the expected centipedes, but there were also a dozen or so scorplings, including several of the smaller assassin scorplings and a few smaller samples of the flesh monster Chalin had controlled. That was going to complicate things. The simple truth of the matter was that Velik had been awake and fighting constantly for 3 days now, maybe longer. He lost track, barring a few breaks that never lasted longer than 20 or 30 minutes. He'd been on the move the whole time. He was tired, and using the hasting potion in conjunction with savage rhythm hadn't done him any favors. It was a miracle he was still on his feet. For all the power his race and class had granted him, he was still mortal, and he knew he was reaching his limits. Grasping hands he'd easily evaded 10 minutes ago snagged at his clothing as he slipped by. Monsters coming at him from every side should have been no issue to sort out. Instead, his mind fumbled to figure out what would reach him first. He could feel the magic building in him, whatever it was. Mana, maybe, or something else. He didn't know, and he didn't care. The important part was that he'd drained it with his last dread lance, and he needed more time to get enough back to use the skill again. The monsters weren't going to give him that time, and he wasn't sure he had it in him to keep fighting much longer. He skewered a scorpling being propelled across the ceiling by the forest of hands, then swung his spear hard to dislodge the body. It crashed into a centipede, weaving its way through the arms growing out of the floor, not killing the monster, but certainly stunning it for a moment. Another centipede immediately took its place, crawling over the insensate body of its companion to reach Velik. Chest heaving, he forced himself to move faster. A second scorpling dropped down from the ceiling on him, too fast for him to stab at midair. Instead, he raised the shaft of his spear overhead as a shield between himself and the monster, flinging it sideways the instant it impacted. Its stinger-tipped tail whipped toward his face, but not fast enough to make contact before it was out of range. A hand grabbed his foot at the same time he was dodging the first flesh beast to reach him, causing him to stumble a single step. That was all it took for the monster to ram into him. Thankfully, it was much smaller than the one with Kalen's face on its meatball head, but smaller was a relative term, and it was still 4 or 5 times heavier than Velik. I can't keep going. What I've built up is going to have to be enough. Velik had a good guess about where the core was, somewhere overhead and sliding through the fleshy ceiling to keep him in range so it could sprout more interfering hands to pluck at him. Right there. He took 3 steps, all the space he could claim in a straight line, and jumped with all the strength he had left in him. A flesh beast lunged in front of him, rearing up on 3 of its 6 legs, but Velik twisted in the air and stabbed his spear into its chest. He landed on the monster feet first, kicking it backward from the impact and tore the spear free. In a way, the interference was a good thing. He'd been stretching how far he thought he could jump and knew he wouldn't have made the landing from his starting point. As the flesh beast slammed into the ground, he jumped off it and reached his target. Without hesitation, Dreadlance roared out of his spear as he stabbed it into the palm of a hand hanging above him. Energy arced upwards, proliferating through the limb and engulfing the ceiling. Flesh exploded again, showering him and every nearby monster in chunks of meat. And something huge slowly slid into the new hole Velik had made. Even as it sagged down into the room, smoke and ash swirling around it, a tendril of flesh whipped out from the hole and caught the lump of what appeared to be blood-splattered bone. "No, you don't." Velik snarled and forced himself back upright. This was his chance, and he wasn't wasting it. Ignoring the scorpling closing in on him, he leaped straight up, spear leading. The spear wasn't getting through that layer of bone, not at the angle Velik was working from. Maybe if he'd been fresh, it would have been a different story. But that wasn't the case. His hands were trembling with fatigue, and his breathing was ragged and labored. So, the bone wasn't the target. The fleshy tendril, trying to haul it back into the ceiling, was. The blade parted the skin-wrapped muscle easily, and the sphere of bone crashed to the floor. Cracks radiated outward from the impact, proving that the shell was vulnerable after all. Velik landed right next to it, paused to kill the scorpling that was flicking its stinger forward, then spun the spear around to face the point down. A blast of pure noise overwhelmed him, blacking out his vision and causing him to sway. Dimly, he recognized the sound as screaming voices united in their demand that he stop. Without the amulet, he wasn't nearly so well protected, and part of his mind simply shut down under the onslaught. "Give up," the voices whispered in his head. "Lay down your weapon. Be still until we call for you. Your power came from us, and it will return to us." Part of him recognized those thoughts as outside interference, his enemy at work undermining his will to fight. But it was just so damn tempting that he almost did it anyway. He didn't need a malevolent voice whispering in his ear to rest. His own body was screaming that at him every time he so much as twitched. He'd fought through the pain and the heavy weight of exhaustion, and all for nothing. He was no closer to winning this fight now than when it had started. The enemy was too much for him, unbeatable, and he'd been a fool to ever set foot in this place. It was easier to just surrender to the inevitable. It would hurt for a moment, and then everything would finally be over. Besides, the dungeon was right. He was part of it, or at least he was supposed to be. Fuck that. The thought came unbidden, a spark of anger that was almost suffocated as soon as it surfaced. But once it had ignited in his mind, it started spreading. No one, not D'Shure, not the lumberjacks he sometimes saw in the forest, not Torwin or Jensen, and certainly not some disgusting monster in a cave, got to tell him to lie down and die. Velik fought. He'd been fighting for 10 years. And he wasn't going to stop today just because his arms were heavy and the monster wanted him to make things easy for it. With his blood pounding in his ears, he snapped back to reality. The bone sphere was still in front of him, but a new hand was growing from the flesh-covered ground beneath it, cradling the sphere in its palm and lifting it back up. A scorpling had crawled up his back and was perched there, clinging to him with its legs digging painfully into his sides and its stinger poised inches from his neck. A single twitch would no doubt cause it to strike. Savage rhythm was still coursing through his body. It wasn't as strong as it had been earlier, but it would be enough. It had to be enough. Velik's hand shot up and grabbed the tail just behind the stinger. Immediately, the scorpling tried to force the barb into his neck, but the difference between their physical stats was so huge that it was no contest. Spinning, he pulled the monster by its tail and gritted his teeth against the hot lines of pain its legs drew across his ribs as it was dislodged. He slammed the scorpling into the next nearest monster, a flesh beast that had taken a step his way as soon as he'd started moving. Without waiting to see the result of his attack, he released the scorpling, grabbed his spear in both hands, and drove it straight down through the bone shell. Wrenching it back and forth powerfully, he widened the hole and scrambled the meat within. Immediately, the entire cave shuddered. The very walls quivered, and the screaming voices reached a crescendo before abruptly cutting off. All of the limbs growing out of the walls, floor, and ceiling fell limp. The only things that didn't stop were the monsters. Velik ripped his spear free, flinging blood through the air as he met the charge of the next monster. At this point, his movements were entirely instinctive, some combination of apex hunter, guiding his senses while Spear Warden moved his body. The fight dragged on while great gouts of blood exploded out of the walls for seemingly no reason. Flesh necrotized in front of his eyes. Not that he had time to stand there and watch it, and chunks of it started falling out of the ceiling. More than one monster was crushed under the monumental weight of it all, and Velik himself was struck on 3 separate occasions. For all that, the battle didn't slow down, not until all the monsters were dead and he was standing on a pile of chunky meat and body parts. Everything was quiet, almost unnervingly so. It wasn't until the flesh lining the cave died that it really hit Velik how it had warped noise, how everything had a grotesque, wet, slapping sound to it. Now that he was surrounded by bare stone walls, the acoustics had completely changed. What a weird thing to notice, he thought to himself as he tried to focus on more important things. The core, if that's what it even was split open down the middle, with the savage remains of that huge brain he'd seen visible inside. It didn't look anything like the massive pillar he'd seen in that dungeon he and Chalin had entered years ago. But then, nothing about this dungeon was normal. He still wasn't even entirely sure it counted as a dungeon. There certainly hadn't been any sort of notifications about entering one or defeating it. Then again, he'd gotten a lot of notifications for killing monsters, and he definitely hadn't read all of them. Going back through them now, he saw one that was unusual. You have slain a shifting flesh amalgamation core, level 47. Was that you, Chalin? He asked the dead lump of brain matter. You and everyone else trapped here? Did this monster consume all of you and take on your memories and skills? He'd probably never know the truth for sure, but maybe things would make a bit more sense once he got a bit of sleep. That wasn't going to happen in the caves, though. Even if he'd felt safe, the smell of rotting meat was quickly filling the tunnels. Slowly, wearily, he started making his way out of the cave complex. At one point, it occurred to him to check his mana compass, and he smiled when he saw it now pointed steadily southwest instead of spinning around wildly. Whether this place truly had been a dungeon or just one massive creature, he'd killed it. Hopefully, the endless tide of monsters flowing out of the forests and into the frontier lands would finally be stemmed. Once he was on the surface, he immediately walked to the nearest stream and hurled himself bodily into the water. 20 minutes wasn't even close to enough to get the stench out of his hair and off his skin, but the mending enchantments in his clothes were hard at work taking care of that. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than nothing. Then he found a place to sleep and, for the first time in half a week, closed his eyes for more than a few minutes. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. He woke feeling strangely refreshed and weary at the same time. The few hours of downtime had revitalized him, but he needed a lot more to regain his full strength. Food was also important for that, but he was confident he could last a few more days before that became a real problem. Plenty of time to hunt. Another pleasant surprise that he'd failed to notice in his near-fugue state when he'd been trudging out of the cave was that he'd made substantial gains to his level and skills. The messages had been lost in the constant noise of kill notifications, meaning he'd gained, not 1, but 3 levels since the last time he'd checked. He didn't know how often that happened, especially for somebody already in the mid-30s, but he was guessing it was pretty rare. Apex Hunter, Dreadlance, and Savage Rhythm had all gone up a rank as well, and he had free points to use on his stats. Without hesitation, he dumped all of them in a Mystic, bringing it up to 38. Dreadlance was powerful, but needing so much time between activations was a handicap that had nearly gotten him killed. Name, Velik. Race, human dustbound. Class, the Black Fang. Level, 38. Physical, 113 plus 18. Mental, 61 plus 2. Mystical, 38 plus 20. Free points, 0. Dekarma, 14,688. Skills, Apex Hunter, rank 6. Spear Warden, rank 8. Dreadlance, rank 2. Savage Rhythm, rank 3. Gear, Harbinger of Dusk, plus 15 pH, plus 5 Mi. Hunter's Cowl, plus 2 Mi. Stalker's Boots, plus 3 pH. Survivalist's Shirt, self-repairing cloak, mystic's earring, plus 15 my. Finally, he'd somehow gained nearly 10,000 dekarmas. That confused him at first, because there was no way he'd killed enough monsters to gain so much. But when he went digging, he found a strange message that explained where the dekarmas came from, even if it invited more questions than it answered. You have completed a quest. Save the frontier from the source of the corruption. Reward, 7,500 dekarmas. One class orb with unique class, the Flesh Crafter. Where did this even come from? He wondered. He'd never even been given a quest by the system, so he wasn't sure how he could have completed it unknowingly. And that reward had him crinkling his nose in disgust. Was that Kalen's class when he became whatever that thing was? Is this the seed to making a new monster just like him? Why would the system give me this as a reward? The temptation to destroy the class or dance through his mind, but it was tempered by the fact that he wasn't entirely sure how to do so, and an entirely rational fear that messing with the orb would somehow trigger it. Overriding the Black Fang, with a class he was completely sure he wanted nothing to do with. Sitting around wasn't going to help him find any answers, and he was sick of dealing with all of this anyway. Groaning, he climbed to his feet and started walking south. Torwin can sort this all out. I just want to kill monsters. They've been running hard all night, and Sildra knew if she stopped to let herself think, she'd break down. So many people had died, or worse, been killed by Torwin. She'd recognize some of them, even if she didn't know their names. And Eye of the Moon had condemned them to death. Every stop, it was the same thing. Torwin killed at her direction, while she hid like a coward, and the townsfolk directed their anger at the monster hunter. It was an hour before dawn, but she could already feel her power starting to wane. The moon hadn't gone down yet, not enough to blind her to the monsters pretending to be human, but it was a good thing they'd finally reached Allnsburth. It was the last stop on their run, and she was hoping and praying that the corruption hadn't reached this far. As soon as they got inside of the town, she knew the truth. There were certainly less corrupted seed-bearers than the other frontier towns, but there weren't none. The town was quiet, with only a few people up and about so early. None of them were human. Strange. Every person I can see is a monster. Where are the humans? Something's wrong, she said quietly. What? Monster, she said, pointing to a man standing by the gate. Her finger drifted to the left to a farmer looking out at a field. Monster. She pointed to a pair of women walking toward the center of town on the main street, then to a street vendor unloading fruit from a burlap sack into the bins in a stall. A guard nearby watched him work. Monster. 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 All of them. Every single person I can see from here is a monster. There could be humans still in their houses sleeping, Torwin speculated. Maybe. Probably. It's just, why are there so many monsters outside and no people? It makes me think the infestation in this town might be worse than the others. I hope not, Torwin muttered. Allsburth is the gateway to the frontier. If the corruption is thick here, that means it's probably spread beyond this region. I'm going to have to make another run to the city to let people know either way, but this gives us reason to believe the danger to the rest of the country might be worse than expected. He surveyed the town, eyes flicking from one person to the next in a way she'd learned meant he was planning his opening attack. Torwin was, frankly, terrifying with his bow, able to fire arrows so fast that his gear couldn't keep up with producing them at the speed he needed. She had no doubt that when he started, there'd be an arrow for each monster well before the first one struck home. Spot for me when the screaming starts, he said, almost absently, his eyes still fixed on the town. People are going to start running, and I need to know if any monsters head out the other gate. I know, she told him. They'd done this twice already tonight. He grunted once, then lifted his bow. An arrow materialized on the string, and, with an easy exhale, he let it fly. Immediately, his hand brought two more up from the quiver beside him. She couldn't even understand how he held them, such that they both landed on the string to be fired in less than a second. It almost looked like he'd thrown one in the air, then snatched it before it could start falling after firing its partner. Another arrow materialized, with 1 second between each arrow, as far as she could tell. That one went into the gate guard, and 2 more real arrows came out of the quiver. 5 seconds later, every visible monster had a feathered shaft sticking out of their throat. There'd been a brief outcry from those few monsters who'd noticed the arrows before being hit, but it was quickly silenced. They sound so human, Sildra thought wretchedly. Kill notices confirm all monsters, Torwin said, not that she needed him to. She'd gotten her own set of notifications for assisting in slaying them. He started running toward the town at a decent clip, and she took off after him. For her, it was a full sprint that ended with ragged breathing and a stitch in her side. And he still reached the gate before she was halfway there, once again making her reconsider the wisdom of skipping out on putting points in a physical. Monsters? He asked. None that I can sense. I guess we're doing this the hard way, he said. Without hesitation, he approached the closest house and started pounding on the door. A minute later, it opened to reveal a bleary-eyed and confused man. Torwin grabbed him by his shirt and pulled him out of the house, then glanced back at Sildra. Human, she mouthed. Your town has been infested with a parasitic monster that gets inside people, eats them from the inside out, and assumes their identities, Torwin told the man. They seem to retain their host body's memories and are adept at pretending to be whoever they've replaced. I've got a way to detect them, but I need everyone outside. Who are you? The man asked, still bewildered. I'm a monster hunter hired to take care of the surge in population, Torwin explained. Now, I need you to start getting people awake and out of their homes so I can root out the monsters. Every single person, no matter how old or how young, needs to be outside. It took some browbeating, but the process was soon well underway to disheartening results. It turned out there was a good reason every single person they'd initially seen outside was a monster. The town was completely infested, even worse off than Deshur had been. Fortunately, they'd developed strategies to help convince people that they were telling the truth. All they needed to do was get the townsfolk involved. Sildra would find a monster, pass that information on to Torwin, and he'd get a few people to help restrain the monster. It wasn't that he needed their help, but this way, when he killed it, they'd get notifications for assisting. He didn't do this with every monster, or even with most of them, but he quickly assembled a throng of people following him as they went up and down streets, cajoling or dragging people out of their homes as needed. It was a bloodbath, with well over half the town dead by the time it was done. Unlike in Deshur, the corrupted seed bearers weren't making any overt moves here. Perhaps they didn't have to, considering they'd outnumbered the true humans until Torwin had started killing them. There were all the usual hysterics Sildra had come to expect. Outrage and anger ruled the day, but through all of that, he never wavered from his grim duty. Over and over again, he told the townsfolk that their friends and family were already dead, that all that was left were monsters masquerading as their loved ones. Sildra wasn't surprised at how little that helped. Once the whole town had been awoken and the monsters realized what was happening, some of them tried to flee. Torwin killed them from a quarter-mile away, his bow practically humming from the heavy vibrations of its string. Others hid in cellars, basements, and attics, but no one was safe from Torwin's senses. Whatever skills he had, or even just raw stats, it was too much for a bunch of people struggling to breach the level 20 mark. You have completed a quest. Save the frontier from the source of the corruption, generating rewards for you and your companions. Reward: 1,000 Dekarmos, 1 class orb with rare class, Druid of the Crescent Moon. You have been granted a new quest. Locate the source of the dungeon seed and destroy it before it can spread more chaos and destruction. The notifications came in unexpectedly when they still had a dozen or so houses left to go through. She saw Torwin pause mid-stride and realized he'd probably received a similar message, but he just dismissed it and got back to work. Thankfully, the quest hadn't lied, and there were no more corrupted seed bearers. They left soon after, the old ranger frowning thoughtfully as they walked the trails back toward Beldred. "What's a dungeon seed?" she asked, pulling him from his musings. What? When we finished the quest to root out the corruption, I got a new one to locate the source of the dungeon seed. I don't know, he admitted, but I have some suspicions. I think it might have been what those 2 boys found years ago. Maybe it's how new dungeons are formed, or maybe it's something else entirely. I guess Morgus wants me to figure out where it came from so I can stop any more from appearing. Torwin came to a full stop and peered at her. He grunted again, then said, "You're going to need to level up some more if you're going to complete that quest." "Well, I did get a class, or to upgrade my class to rare as a reward for completing the quest," she said. "That's sure to help." He nodded. "You'd better hope it removes those astrological limitations from your skills." "It's called Druid of the Crescent Moon," she said. "Ah, I see. It probably won't help with that particular problem, then." "No," she agreed. "But it's a start. Did you get a reward, too?" "Just 1,000 dekarmos. I won't complain about it, but it's hardly life-changing for me. I wonder if Jensen got anything. He helped a lot with D. Sure, so that's got to be worth something, right?" "We'll find out in a few hours," Torwin said. By unspoken agreement, they both picked up the pace, eager to get back. The temporary camp was all but abandoned by the time Jensen made his way back there. He'd spent most of his night in Beldrit, helping refugees get settled in. It was somewhat ghoulish to slot people into the homes left behind by the victims of monsters in this town, but that was how it went. He still thought it made more sense to send them back to D. Sure. But given the state of the town, he could see why the people who were supposed to be living there weren't eager to return. Besides, there was safety in numbers, and D. Sure had been devastated enough that a regular old monster horde coming out of the forest would wipe the rest of them out. He wouldn't be at all surprised to learn that the town ended up abandoned before winter set in. Really, he supposed it depended on exactly how many more monsters his master and Sildra found in the other towns. "I hope that innkeeper isn't a monster. I like the food there." With any luck, he'd get another night's sleep in a warm bed and a hearty breakfast before Torwin got them heading back south to civilization. Jensen could admit that he wasn't looking forward to that, not because of the walk, but because of the confrontation that awaited him at the end. His father was not going to be pleased that he'd deviated from his instructions, no matter how good the class he'd earned ended up being. "You have completed a quest. Save the frontier from the source of the corruption. Reward, 7,500 dekarmos, Grenadier's Flask." Jensen murmured. "What's this now?" They must have finished with the other towns. The dekarma value was nothing, but he supposed it helped offset some of the money he'd spent blowing up that house. Jensen promptly ignored that part of the message and focused on the other half, the Grenadier's Flask. He'd seen some made by the combined efforts of alchemists and enchanters, but to the best of his knowledge, it wasn't a piece of gear available through the system store. Then again, it would take years to read everything the store could offer, and not a single piece of it was worth the truly outrageous asking prices. The flask had the ability to fill itself with a volatile, highly explosive agent, and was enchanted so that, when thrown, it would shatter, leaving a swath of destruction wherever it landed. The cap of the flask would then start to regrow a new bottle over the next week or so, which would slowly fill itself again. Depending on the strength of the enchantments, it could be anywhere from 10 days to 2 months between uses. If it's a quest reward, I'd hope it skews more to the short end of the spectrum. He'd have to ask Torwin to use Identify when he saw his master again to get the exact specifications. They'd probably be back soon, since apparently they'd wiped out every single corrupted seed bearer in the area already. Knowing the speed Sildra moved at, and considering how tired she had to be by now, he figured it'd either be 2 to 3 hours if it was just Torwin, or more like 6 to 8 if it was both of them. Either way, Jensen was taking a nap while he could. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The mana compass still pointed to monsters with a lot of mana in them, but Velik didn't go out of his way to hunt for them. There'd be plenty of time for that later. It wasn't like the champions were going anywhere. For the moment, he just wanted somewhere safe so he could properly rest. It had been 2 days of nonstop running after he'd caught a few hours of sleep. He was tired, sore, and hungry, surviving mostly on his high physical stat and the occasional pieces of fruit he snatched up as he moved. The terrain was somewhat familiar to him, making it a bit easier to recall good foraging spots that wouldn't slow him down much. When he did finally return home, he pushed the door closed, gave silent thanks that, mending, kept all his clothes clean, and dropped face down on his bed, where he immediately passed out. It had been noon when he'd gone to sleep, but it was just after dawn when he woke back up. Lost a whole day, he thought to himself as he stretched. Worth it. Though he was lacking a considerable portion of his strength at the moment, Velik wasn't afraid of what he'd run into this close to the edge of the forest. He headed out without fear, then stopped to look around. At first, he thought something had gone wrong with Apex Hunter. All of his sensory abilities were folded into it, and he relied heavily on them to lock down the locations of nearby monsters without having to manually search every square foot of the forest. There was nothing within half a mile of him, or if there was, it was too quiet and stealthy for him to detect it passively. That only happened after he'd personally killed every monster in the area, though, and unless he'd started hunting in his sleep, that hadn't happened. Is it over? The source of all the monsters was probably Kalen's dungeon, and that's gone now. But that couldn't have rippled all the way to here yet. After a few minutes of consideration, he decided it was probably Torwin's fault, or possibly his apprentice. The professional monster hunters had had a few days to work clearing out the area while Velik traveled and then slept. If new monsters weren't pushing in anymore, then it was possible that this was just what the forest looked like now. Another month or so to take care of any strays wandering and might finally see the region at peace again. And then what? He wondered. He was leaving. He knew that much. The problem he'd caused so many years ago was finally fixed, and he didn't know anything to these people beyond that. His conversations with Torwin and Jensen had clued him into the fact that there was a lot to life he knew nothing about, and he thought he should probably take a few steps toward fixing that. The first one would be to sell the champion seeds. No, the first one would be to go back into the deep wood and finish harvesting the rest of them. He was level 38 now. Maybe that task would push him up to 40 and open a new skill slot. Even if it didn't, he needed to work on Savage Rhythm and Dreadlance. He suspected he could fold the former into Spear Warden at some point, but he needed time to figure out the skill's intricacies. For today, he would survey the frontier and see how things really stood. Just because there were no monsters here did not mean there were none anywhere. His normal circuit would take a few hours and would serve to familiarize him with the current state of things. Then he needed to find Torwin and offload his dubious quest reward. Hopefully, the older hunter would know why he'd even been credited with completing a quest in the first place. Smiling to himself as he started thinking of what his next concrete steps would be to begin a new life somewhere else, Velik started to run through the trees. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. It turned out that Torwin was just as eager to find Velik as he was to find Torwin. Somewhere between Beldrit and Cellarit, they noticed each other and immediately veered off course to join up. The old monster hunter looked the same as always, though there was perhaps a touch of sadness softening his face that hadn't been there before. "So, you survived," Torwin said. "We've noticed the monsters flowing into the area slowing down already. I'm guessing that means you had some measure of success." "If you could call it that," Velik told him. "I don't really understand a lot of what happened out there, but I think the threat is ended." The two started walking to Cellarit at Torwin's insistence. More specifically, they headed to the Raven's Nest for lunch. The time spent reaching town was filled with updates about what had happened. Velik describing the strange cave he'd been trapped in and a monster he'd found at the bottom of it. Torwin told him about the massive death toll the corrupted seed bearers had inflicted on the frontier, about the infestation that none of them had noticed despite it probably having been ongoing for a year or more. Sildra found them, Velik asked in disbelief. "More like she was the instrument of a god's will," Torwin said. "The quest came from him, no doubt. She spread it to us when we aligned with her purpose and helped her achieve what Morgus wanted. I didn't know gods could influence the system. Only in specific ways, if the priests are to be believed. Granting quests is one of the big ones. Another example of things I don't know that I should." He knew it wasn't his fault. He'd spent most of his life living in the woods, killing monsters, and he was good at it. It was doing everything else that he was struggling with. Hopefully, Torwin would have some good advice about where to learn all the things a normal person was supposed to know by the time they were an adult. Velik had plenty of Dekarmos. It wouldn't be a problem to pay for tutoring or classes. "There's something I wanted to talk to you about," he said, earning a curious glance from Torwin. "I kind of need some advice about the future." "What about it?" I'm leaving the region as soon as I'm certain the monster threat is truly resolved, and I could use some input about what to do next. I don't really even know what my options are. Ah, that's good. I wanted to talk to you about the exact same thing. I'll tell you what, let's get a meal in our bellies first, and we can discuss what the world outside of your little corner has to offer. If you're going after the rest of those champions, you should do it immediately, Torwin said between bites of sausage. I'll delay my return home as long as possible, but I already sent messages ahead about the corruption. I can guarantee I'll be receiving orders to report everything in person in the next few days. Don't you want some of the seeds for yourself? Velik asked. The old hunter chuckled. I've got a decades-long career of hunting monsters, and you would not believe how rich that has made me. Don't get me wrong, those champions are easy money if you're strong enough to kill them, but I don't need it. And Jensen definitely doesn't. His family is rich enough to buy a god. We're here to get him experience, and that's been done. Go, clean up the mess, get paid for it, and fund your new life. And then what? Well, Torwin said slowly, drawing the single word out. He stared down at his breakfast and took another bite while he thought. You've got the skills and temperament to be a professional monster hunter, I think. You've got some gaps in your practical knowledge, but there's no denying the talent for it. I'm not sure you realize how much of a feat it is soloing a champion elite at level, let alone higher, not to mention clearing an entire dungeon. It's not like it was easy, Velik said dryly. Torwin snorted. People won't believe you if you try to tell them what you did. It's too preposterous, even for someone with a unique class and racial subtype like you've got. I can vouch for you and sponsor your registration if you decide to try, but you'll still have to do your time as an iron. No one gets around that. An iron? Iron ranked. It means you'd be a probationary member. Most monster hunters work in groups, and the guild has to know that you can carry your own weight, follow orders, and not recklessly endanger the rest of your team. I imagine they'll have to come up with a few new tests for someone as strong as you are. It's not often new applicants are higher than level 15. When Velik didn't immediately respond, Torwin hastened to add, if you're interested, of course. You got plenty of other options. Mercenary work if you don't mind fighting other people instead of monsters, or you could attach yourself to a wealthy house like Jensen's. There's probably 20 or 30 notable ones that take on retainers. I don't even know what to say to that. I understand what the words mean, but what would I actually be signing myself up for? What obligations does being an iron-ranked monster hunter or a retainer to a powerful family come with? Will that leave me any time for myself? Do I even need the support of some organization? Will they help me figure out what this class or means? There's something else to consider, Torwin said. Your friend who had the quest. Not my friend, Velik muttered. She got what? I thought. Well, regardless. It seems that Morgus isn't quite done with her. When we finished purging the corruption, she got a new quest to locate whoever or whatever put that dungeon seed in your path and stop it from ever doing anything like that again. I still don't understand why I got roped into that, Velik said. I didn't do anything to save the towns. True, but you did destroy the dungeon that the seeds were coming from. We treated the symptoms, but you purged the disease out of the frontier. Besides, when a god grants you a reward through the system, the smart thing to do is to offer praise, accept the gift, and shut your mouth. Velik couldn't help but chuckle. There was certainly some sense to that advice, though he couldn't think of a reward he'd want less than a class or for that cursed class that had taken over Kalen's life and turned him into a monster. He still wasn't sure how that had all come about, whether Kalen's new monstrous class had pushed him to seek out and consume other people, or whether the dungeon core had formed in the very beginning and taken him over. Perhaps it had been a bit of both. Finding whoever had dropped that seed there and ensuring that they couldn't ever cause that kind of harm again sounded like a worthwhile goal, now that he thought about it. Sildra's quest was important to him, but the simple truth was that he didn't have the first clue how to go about it. It had taken 10 years to find Challen again, and he'd only been a few hundred miles away. But maybe Torwin knew someone who could help. The class orb, he said. Do you think it's a clue? Is that why the quest rewarded it to me? Could we use it to find whoever left that dungeon seed behind? We as in you or me? No, I doubt it. Somebody with a different class and access to a set of skills we can only dream about might be able to. Once someone figures out where to look, that's when people like us get sent in to narrow things down and take care of the problem. And do you know somebody like that? Velik asked. Well now, Torwin grinned. That seems like the kind of resources a guild or noble house might be able to offer, doesn't it? I don't know, Velik told him honestly. Right? Perhaps a place to round out your, education before anything else. That would be a good start. They both sat silently for a little while, pondering the discussion and finishing up lunch or breakfast in Velik's case. Finally, Torwin said, this might be a problem better posed to Jensen. I'm sure his family has access to tutors and instructors on all sorts of subjects. The question is which ones you could buy the services of without indebting yourself to the Alderworths. If there was one thing he didn't want, it was to have obligations to some noble family. Working as a mercenary or a guild monster hunter was one thing. Those were jobs. He'd maintain his independence and could walk away if he needed to. But there was no doubt in Velik's mind that if he let some noble get his hooks in him, it would end poorly. Education, independence, revenge, Velik muttered. Torwin said nothing, though Velik knew he'd heard every syllable. He just ate his last bite of food and drained the remainder of his beer. Whatever he thought of Velik's plan, he wasn't willing to offer an opinion. He just stood up, glanced around, and sighed. I'll talk to Jensen and see if he has any ideas. It's probably better to keep you away from him, anyway. His father's already going to be a handful to deal with since he decided to go a different direction with his class evolution. There's no need for you to get dragged through all of that with us, but maybe we can give you some ideas for some independent instructors. You'll probably be a few weeks behind us, anyway. Things should have cooled down by then. How will I find you? Velik asked. Oh, just ask around at the guild hall. Someone will get a message to me. Now, I'm going to go roll my lazy apprentice's ass out of bed. Good luck claiming the rest of those champion seeds. I would advise you to hold on to them when you arrive in Cravel until you can have someone appraise them. Figuring out how much they're worth can be tricky. It depends on a whole bunch of stuff, not just level. Solid advice, Velik said. Then he surprised himself by adding, it was good working with you. I don't usually have any help keeping the monster population under control. You and Jensen took a lot of pressure off me. It's my job, the old monster hunter said simply. They pay me for it, though I doubt I'll be getting any thanks this time around. I'll see you in a month or so. With that, Torwin walked across the room and ascended a staircase. Velik sat at the table for another minute thinking, then snickered when he heard an outraged bellow overhead, followed by a loud thump as something heavy struck the floorboards. Clean up, cash out, and start living my life for myself, he thought. Yeah, that's a good start. But someday we're going to figure out who started all this, and we're going to make him pay. Unconsciously, his hand strayed down to his hip pouch where the class orb containing Kalen's class rested. He wasn't sure how, not yet, but he knew it was a clue, one he intended to follow to the very end. If Sildra intended to complete her quest with him, she'd have to get a lot stronger a lot faster. Plenty of monsters left. With the source dried up, she can handle defending the towns, what's left with them. Maybe it'll be enough. Ignoring the loud arguing coming from Jensen's room above his head, Velik stood up from the table and strode out the front door. The work wasn't done yet. The split-tailed bull stood 10 feet tall at the shoulders and was wider than any 3 people standing abreast. It had horns like spears and hooves that could crush stone. The steel bars holding it back looked far too flimsy to keep such a monster confined, and Velik was sure if it had been given any room to gain momentum, it would have easily crashed right through them. He stood as part of a group of 32 iron-ranked monster hunters in a field just east of the city of Cravel. If he'd bother to climb one of the trees ringing the field, he'd be able to see the walls from here, not that he thought he'd get away with that. Their field instructors all stood in a line, flanking the bull's cage while Peveril paced back and forth. He ignored the way the bull's eyes were locked on him, probably because he was deliberately aggravating the monster with that stupid scarf he always wore flapping around in the wind. Every 3 months, we do this trial, Peveril announced. Some of you pass. Most of you don't. Occasionally a few of you die. That hasn't happened in the last 4 years, but this is a dangerous job, and even under the most controlled conditions, mistakes happen. I see some familiar faces from the last trial, and I hope you'll share your experience with those who are here for the first time. Velik didn't bother looking around. His fellow irons weren't important to him. despite the past 12 weeks of his instructors attempting to instill a sense of camaraderie in the group. They all knew Velik was an outsider. He was here to pass the trial, where he'd almost certainly skip bronze rank and ascend immediately to silver, maybe even gold. Still, he had to prove his ability to work with a team. There were no exceptions, no matter how famous or powerful an iron was. They went through the guild's training program, or they left the guild, and Velik needed access to their resources for the moment. He was quickly losing patience with the whole process. However much his sponsor promised him, it would be worth it. Would have been nice if Torwin could have just found this information out for me and saved me the time. Today, you'll face this monster in groups of 4. None of you are capable of killing this alone. At least half the irons glanced at Velik when Peveril said that, but he ignored them and continued. But fortunately, a monster hunter doesn't have to be alone. You've been placed in teams that complement each other's strengths and compensate for each other's weaknesses. Your team leaders will draw lots in a moment, and will clear the field to give the first team room to fight. Velik's team leader was a bossy woman with a hair-trigger temper who hated Velik's guts. He'd quickly realized there was nothing he could do to stay in her good graces and hadn't bothered trying, something that seemed to infuriate her all the more. Admittedly, it probably didn't help things that he hadn't bothered to learn her name, but he planned on never seeing her again after today, so it was a little late now. We'll be judging you not only in how you act as a team, but in how well you fulfill your individual roles, Peveril said. It is entirely possible for some members of the team to pass and others to fail. However, if anyone on your team dies, you will all fail instantly. Ensuring the safety of all hunters involved is your top priority. Killing the monster is secondary to that. This wasn't anything new. Everyone knew the rules, and it was honestly starting to annoy him that the lead instructor was wasting their time going over this again. They all knew what monster they'd be fighting, had known for 3 days now to give them time to come up with their strategies. He tuned out the rest of Peveril's speech until it was time for them to figure out what order they'd be fighting in. When his team's leader came back with a grimace on her face, he could guess what had happened. Number 1, she reported to the groans of the other 2 people on his team. Do you think it was rigged on account of? You know, the boy with the bow asked. He was around the same age as Velik, but he still had a lot of baby fat hanging off his face. It made him look a lot younger than he actually was, and the spotty stubble pretending to be a mustache across his upper lip didn't help things. No, I think it's just bad luck. It's fine. We'll just have to show everyone else how it's done, assuming we can all remember our jobs and stick to them, the leader said. Got it, Millie. The boy dutifully responded. Millie? That doesn't seem right. Maybe it's a nickname? Millie turned a sharp look on Velik and waited for him to say something. He returned her gaze steadily, but remained silent. With a huff, her eyes shifted over to the other woman on their team, the useless one. She was in her mid-20s and seemed to have some sort of laborer class focused on harvesting resources. That meant she sucked in a fight, and Velik honestly wasn't sure why she was trying to be a monster hunter with that class. You up for this, Lesta? Millie asked softly. The woman nodded and patted one of the 4 knives sheathed around her waist. Each one was shaped differently, sometimes with hooks on the end or flared blades designed to carve around different musculatures and ligaments. Velik would be the first to admit that he was no butcher, being far more interested in the extermination of monsters than in harvesting them for parts. But it all seemed like overkill to him. 1 knife was plenty. I know what to do, she confirmed. Velik? Millie asked, her voice harsh. Don't worry about me, he told her. I'm not, she snapped back. I'm worried about you letting everyone else down. If Velik had a tendency to go a little off script, that was only because Millie was bad at evaluating her team's capabilities and kept trying to get more out of them than they were capable of giving. Things consistently went wrong. The other irons panicked and made the situation worse, and Velik was forced to step in to salvage things. It was hardly his fault. He always performed his role perfectly, right up to the point where everything went wrong. The real mystery to him was how Millie had gotten sponsored for a leadership role in the first place. But he wasn't here to argue about guild hierarchy. He was here to get through iron rank and gain access to the full guild support infrastructure. As long as he made a decent showing in this fight and no one died, things would be fine. That bull was at most level 25, according to the feeling he got from Apex Hunter, so he wasn't terribly worried about it. The challenge here wasn't to kill it, which he could do in less than a second, but to keep its attention on him while his team did their best to kill it much less efficiently. Final status reviews, Millie ordered. We're up in 2 minutes. Dutifully, Velik checked his status. Not that there was much to see. Name, Velik. Race, human dustbound. Class, the Black Fang. Level, 41. Physical, 119 plus 29. Mental, 64 plus 6. Mystical, 44 plus 40. Free points, 0. Karma, 124,732. Skills, Apex Hunter, rank 6. Spear Warden, rank 9. Dreadlance, rank 3. Savage Rhythm, rank 5. Burden of the Beast, rank 2. Gear, Harbinger of Dusk, plus 15 pH, plus 5 Mi. The Six Plague, plus 10 Mi. Night Striders, plus 6 pH, plus 2 Mi. Invoker's Pendant, plus 20 Mi. Ear Cuff of Unbreakable Will. Raven's Feather Cloak, plus 15 Mi. Twilight Bond. Heart of the Inferno, plus 10 pH. Chimeric Vest, plus 4 pH, plus 2 Mi. Chimeric Pants, plus 4 pH, plus 2 Mi. As always, he had a laugh at how foolish he'd been back on the frontier. He'd had 3 pieces of gear, with only his weapon being any good. Since coming to Cravel, he'd spent a small fortune equipping himself with the best he could find, and now had some 25 levels worth of extra stats, not to mention 5 different active abilities from his gear. His backup weapon, which the system identified as the Six Plague for some reason, wouldn't actively contribute its stat bump until he was holding it, but for this fight, he wanted the spear he'd been using for years. First team approach. Everyone else hit the sidelines, Peveril called. Millie led them to where the head instructor was standing. He gave them a once-over, almost sneering at Velik for a moment before catching himself, and nodded. Any final questions before we open the cage? He asked. Velik let his gaze wander over to the split-tailed bull, then passed it to where 7 identical cages held the monsters the other teams would fight at the far end of the field. They'd gotten the largest, most impressive specimen of the lot for their battle. No wonder the team lead was so upset. Not only do we not get to witness the other fights and learn from their mistakes, we got the strongest one. The instructors had disappeared with the rest of the irons, forming a ring to protect the other teams if needed and clearly marking out the boundaries of the arena his team would be fighting on. Velik had never fought this particular monster, but part of every Iron's training regime, including classroom studying. They'd gone through dozens of bestiaries, learning the most common monsters, their behaviors, habitats, diets, and what kinds of skills they were known to possess. He'd taken it even further, privately funding outside tutors on a variety of other topics he'd learned his knowledge was criminally deficient in. If he'd known half of what he did now a year ago, he had put an end to that mess on the frontier long before the guild had gotten involved. Good luck, Millie, Peveril said. I know you can do this. If I had any luck, I wouldn't be going first, Dad, she joked. I didn't realize they were related, Velik thought with some surprise. Now that he looked, though, he could see some resemblance in the shape of their noses and the ridge of their eyebrows. He wondered which one of them had decided they hated him first and spread the attitude to the other, or if they'd both arrived at that conclusion independently. You have 30 seconds to prepare, Peveril said. He slapped his hand onto a square metal plate on the front of the cage, then turned and jogged off to the sidelines. None of them said anything. They just spread out to take their assigned positions, leaving Velik alone in front of the cage to stare the bull in the eyes. Right on cue, the magic in the cage swirled through the bars, releasing each side to fold out and fall. The bull, not one to ponder on its change in circumstances, immediately lowered its horns and charged.